The danger began with a scent, a faint, pleasant sweetness drifting through terraced hallways at dusk, rising from glass bottles kept carefully out of sight. London's fog carried stranger perfumes in those years: chloroform from surgeries, coal smoke from factories, and now this, a soft, sugary note that slipped beneath doors and into lungs before anyone thought to question it. Mothers kept it on the mantel. Fathers measured it by lamplight. Doctors prescribed it with the confidence of men who had never seen its shadow. They called it medicine, a blessing for coughs, for nerves, for restless children who would not sleep. But look closely. The curtains are drawn too often in these homes, the children pale and quiet, the parents moving through the day with a slow, dreamy calm that is not peace but poison. Behind the velvet respectability lies a truth. London refused to name families were dying, not from illness, but from the very cure meant to save them. And the danger was no longer drifting. It was spreading. One dose too much, one bottle too trusted, one night too quiet, and a household that had seemed safe by candlelight could, by morning, fall into tragedy. This is the story of the medicine that slipped into British life like a kindness and revealed itself only when it was too late. Subscribe and stay with me. More fog-lit truths wait in the corners, where London's cures became its killers. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? It began, as many Victorian tragedies did, with something deceptively small. A bottle slim, amber-tinted, cork pressed neatly into its mouth standing innocently on the mantelpiece above a crackling coal fire. It belonged to the Haraway family of Bloomsbury, but it might just as easily have belonged to any respectable home in London. The city was full of identical bottles in those years, simple glass vessels containing hope, comfort, and something else entirely. In the soft evening light, the liquid inside caught the glow of the flames, shimmering with an allure that no one in the household questioned. Why would they? The label promised calm, rest, relief, and families, especially those with delicate children or anxious mothers, clung to such promises more tightly than they realized. Mrs. Haraway lifted the bottle often delicately at first, as if holding something fragile, then more confidently as the weeks passed. She admired its sweetness, the faint perfume that rose whenever the cork was loosened, a scent that threaded itself into the curtains, the carpets, even into the thin London fog that pressed against the windows each evening. A scent so pleasant, so gentle, that she never noticed anything sinister in it. The advertisements called it a modern blessing, and respectable doctors praised its reliability. She trusted men with titles. She trusted the printed word, and she trusted the bottle. Her son, Charles, pale and slight at 8 years old, coughed through most nights. The tonic soothed him that much was true. A teaspoon before bed stirred into warm milk, and his breathing slowed. His eyes fluttered closed. Peace drifted through the small bedroom like a soft veil. It felt miraculous to a mother who had spent countless nights pacing the narrow stairway for fear her child would choke, or shiver, or simply fade. Now, after a dose, he slept almost instantly. So did she. So did the entire house. Only Mr. Haraway, returning late from the counting house, found something odd in the silence. A household with a child should never be so still. But exhaustion muffled his curiosity, and the sweet breath of the medicine lingering faintly in the air softened every thought he might have had. Before long, he too began taking a small dose for his nerves, just as the doctor suggested. He found that it eased the weight in his chest, eased the worries, eased everything. The servants felt it too. They spoke in whispers about how the family seemed different, softer, slower. The cook noted that meals went unfinished. The maid observed that laughter grew rarer. Even the nurse, who adored Charles, found it harder each morning to rouse him from sleep. His limbs felt floppy, his breath slow. But children grew tired sometimes, she reasoned, and the doctor himself had said this tonic was perfectly safe. Victorian London believed in progress, in chemistry, in refined cures capable of banishing old fears. So no one questioned how a single bottle could empty so quickly, or why it needed replacing so often. Apothecaries were delighted to provide more, always more, for families like the Harraways. They had no shortage of customers. Yet even in that gracious home with its polished silver, its velvet drapes, its tidy rows of books, an unease began to gather. The sort of unease that hides in corners, watching, waiting. The kind that arrives only after one has looked too long into a mirror and seen a face a little too pale, a little too thin, a little too dependent on the sweetness inside an amber bottle. Still, the Harraways did not know. How could they? The danger did not roar. It whispered, drifting through hallways with each quiet dose. It softened the edges of their lives until they no longer noticed how close they had come to something irreversible. And on the mantelpiece, the bottle glowed warmly in the firelight, a small, shining promise that would soon take more than it ever gave. There was a time when London's fog carried only the familiar scents of the age, coal smoke drifting from chimneys, damp wool steaming near hearths, the metallic bite of the Thames on cold mornings. But as the mysterious tonic found its way into more homes, another smell began weaving itself through the city, faint, sugary, and strangely soothing. It slipped under doors, clung to stair rails, nestled in fabrics, until even the most unobservant Londoner could taste something sweet upon the air without ever lifting a bottle to their lips. The Harraway home breathed this sweetness more every day. It greeted Mrs. Harraway each morning before she rose from bed, drifting through the cracks of her chamber door. It followed her down the stairway, where the maid had already polished the banister until it gleamed. It wound its way across the drawing room and up toward the mantelpiece, where the amber bottle stood like a tiny glass sentinel. She found comfort in that scent. It meant peace. It meant rest. It meant Charles would sleep without coughing himself breathless. But sweetness can hide many things. The nursery curtains absorbed it like heavy sponges, releasing the scent each time they swayed in the faint draughts that slipped through the window frames. On mornings when Charles did not stir easily, the fragrance felt thicker, cloying, as if it pressed itself against his cheeks. He breathed it in with each shallow inhale, unaware that the comfort he felt was not natural sleep, but something far more calculated. London, too, was changing. In parlours across the city, from Mayfair to Lambeth, people commented on the new pleasantness in the air, joking that the fog had learned to perfume itself. In truth, dozens of tiny corks were being eased from dozens of identical bottles at nearly the same hour each night. The city was dosing itself. Families simply did not realize it. Apothecaries made special mention of it when customers stepped into their shops. "Ah," they would say with a courteous nod, "you carry the scent of Dr. Welbury's restorative." "A fine choice, madam." And the ladies would smile, pleased to be recognized as progressive in their medicinal preferences. The doctor's advertisements claimed the formula was light as vapor, safe as mother's milk, a statement that paired beautifully with the fragrance drifting out of parlours and drawing rooms. Inside the Harraway residence, the sweetness coated every surface. It softened the edges of mirrors, blunted the sharpness of corners, dimmed the brightness of mornings. It made the house feel gentler, quieter, a quiet that at first seemed luxurious. Even Mr. Harraway remarked how peaceful things felt when he returned in the evenings, though he admitted he could not quite place why. The servants whispered more loudly now. The cook complained that food, once aromatic and inviting, now tasted faintly of the tonic. Bread seemed sweeter, meat seemed duller. Even tea felt oddly perfumed. She insisted it had nothing to do with her cooking. "The very air is changing," she said to the housemaid with wide, serious eyes. The nurse noticed something else. The scent seemed strongest on nights when Charles struggled most to wake. She found him sleeping deeper each week, his lashes resting like soft shadows on pale cheeks. "He is simply overtired," she reassured herself. Children grew quickly, and growth demanded rest. Yet her reassurances felt lighter than they once had, as though the sweetness were thinning her certainty along with the boy's strength. Still, no one dared to question the bottle. It was trusted, respected, endorsed. The sweet odor wafting through the house was proof only of its popularity, or so they thought. But beneath the pleasantries, London was beginning to breathe something dangerous, a softness in the air that weakened limbs, a perfume that dulled thought, a fragrance that hid its intention beneath the innocent sweetness that families welcomed without hesitation. In the Haraway home, the scent grew stronger each night, like a visitor settling in for a long stay. And no one yet realized that it meant the danger was no longer merely in the bottle, it was in the air itself. No tragedy in Victorian London ever gained momentum without first being blessed by a man in a fine coat and polished boots. And so it was with the Haraways, and with countless families who trusted the wisdom of the medical men who moved with quiet authority through the city. Dr. Atherton was one such man, tall, silver-haired, with a voice soft enough to soothe a crying infant and firm enough to silence a debating father. People believed him before he even opened his satchel. He had been visiting the Haraway household for years, first to examine the newborn Charles, then to ease Mrs. Haraway's bouts of faintness, and always to assure them their concerns were nothing out of the ordinary. London was a city of ailments, nerves, vapors, chills, coughs. Such things were as common as the fog itself. But rarely did Dr. Atherton leave a home without offering something from his satchel, a bottle or a powder, a cordial or a tonic, each bearing a label written in elegant script and sealed with professional pride. It was with that same confident hand that he uncorked the amber bottle now so familiar in the Haraway home. "Just a teaspoon," he said with that small, almost paternal smile. For the boy's cough, perfectly harmless, pleasant even. He tilted the bottle toward the lamplight, watching the liquid catch the glow like melted honey. Then he tapped it with his finger, a gesture of casual assurance, a gesture that said he knew precisely what he was doing. The sweet scent drifted outward once more, curling in the air between himself and Mrs. Haraway. She breathed it in without hesitation. It smelled like relief. "Will it make him sleep?" she asked, almost shyly. Mothers were expected to be anxious, but not overly so. "It will lull him gently," Dr. Atherton replied, his tone dipped in smooth conviction. "Children need rest. Too little sleep weakens them." He did not mention, perhaps did not know, or did not wish to know, that the tonic did far more than coax slumber, that it calmed the nerves until they sagged like wet linen, that it slowed breathing until it bordered on something dangerous, that it blurred the line between healing and harm. Doctors of the era carried an unwavering belief in the power of chemistry. They stood proudly at the dawn of a modern age, convinced they were turning science into salvation. They trusted the new compounds appearing monthly in their journals, sent with glowing reviews from fellow physicians who had also not looked closely enough. And so Dr. Atherton prescribed the tonic with a flourish, the way a priest might offer a sacrament. He carried the scent of it wherever he went. When he placed his gloves on the Haraway table, the sweetness clung to the fingertips. When he leaned over Charles to listen to the boy's shallow breaths, the odor mingled with the dust of the curtains. When he tucked the bottle into Mrs. Haraway's hand, he did so with the confidence of a man absolutely certain of the righteousness of his actions. He never saw the maid exchange a worried glance with the nurse. He never noticed the slight tremor in Mrs. Haraway's voice. He never wondered why Charles's color had grown paler with each visit. He saw only what he expected to see, a polite household grateful for his care. Doctors, after all, were not trained to suspect themselves. When he gathered his satchel and bowed his farewell, the scent of the tonic lingered behind him, clinging to the rooms like a blessing. His bootsteps echoed down the stone path outside, firm and sure, leaving the Harraways with instructions that seemed simple enough. "A teaspoon in the evening," he repeated, "and if his cough worsens, increase it slightly. You'll know when he needs more." He meant it kindly, but kindness, in that era, was often the smoothest path toward ruin, and with every confident stroke of his pen, every unhesitating prescription, every reassuring smile, Dr. Atherton unknowingly nudged another family closer to the quiet danger, spreading through London, one teaspoon at a time. In Victorian London, there was no shortage of ailments to soothe, and no shortage of doctors prepared to soothe them. Life in the city tugged at the nerves, strained the lungs, chilled the bones, and pressed upon the heart with a weight that few dared to admit aloud. And so the amber bottle, the tonic with its soft sweetness and its velvet promises, soon became more than a remedy for coughs. It became the answer to nearly everything. Mrs. Harraway discovered this gradually, almost without meaning to. One evening, after a day of tending to Charles's restlessness and her husband's absent mood, she found herself exhausted in a way sleep alone could not mend. Her hands trembled as she prepared the fire. Her breath fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. It was not illness, she told herself, merely weariness, a mother's weariness, the kind no one ever spoke of, but everyone felt. Her gaze lifted to the mantelpiece. The bottle glowed faintly in the firelight, casting a warm amber halo across the marble. She remembered Dr. Atherton's words, harmless, calming, pleasant. A teaspoon for Charles. A little more, perhaps, for adults in need of rest. Her fingers curled around the glass before she had fully decided to take it. The cork released with a soft sigh, as though relieved to be opened. The scent drifted upward, sweet, comforting, seductive in its gentleness. She poured only a small measure, just enough to steady herself. And in that moment, without knowing it, she joined an entire city of men and women who had begun turning to the same remedy, each time life pressed too heavily on their shoulders. Behind lace curtains and polished doors, London was dosing itself into a softer, quieter version of living. If the air felt sweeter across Bloomsbury that winter, it was because the Harraways were not alone. A factory worker took the tonic to ease the ache in his lungs. A seamstress sipped it from a teacup to calm her trembling hands. Gentlemen used it to silence the worries they dared not express. Mothers offered it to infants who would not sleep, and children, pale and quiet, swallowed it obediently because the adults said it would help. Each dose made the world feel a fraction gentler, a little slower, a little farther away. Within the Harraway home, the tonic soon became a companion to every inconvenience. A teaspoon for Charles's cough, another for his nerves after nightmares, a few drops for Mrs. Harraway's migraines, a swallow for Mr. Harraway when his thoughts churned too loudly after work. Even the nurse admitted to taking a bit on nights when her limbs ached. And because the medicine delivered what it promised, sleep, calm, forgetfulness, no one questioned its widening use. "Better this than hysteria," Dr. Atherton once remarked with a knowing smile, unaware of the layers of irony settling around him like mist. But cures, when too generous, have a way of becoming thieves. The Harraways began to eat less as their appetites faded. Their mornings grew slower. Their eyes lost a measure of brightness, replaced by a dreamy sheen that made them seem almost otherworldly. The servants whispered that the house felt bewitched, too quiet, too still, as though wrapped in cotton. Charles laughed less. Mrs. Harraway sighed more. Mr. Harraway fell asleep in his chair with the paper still folded in his lap. Yet no one saw danger in any of it. They saw only the charm of a modern cure that softened life's sharp edges. And so the bottle emptied faster, and the apothecary sold them another, and another. Each new cork sealed their fate a little tighter. London's greatest mistake had been placing too much faith in the things that promised comfort. For comfort, especially the kind bottled and sweetened, is rarely given freely. It always asks for something in return, and the price the Harraways were about to pay was far higher than any of them could have imagined. The house had never been silent before. Not truly. Even on the calmest evenings, when Charles slept soundly and Mr. Harraway read by lamplight, there was always some small, comforting noise, the tick of the mantel clock, the distant rattle of a carriage on the street, the soft footfall of the maid moving through the corridors. These sounds stitched the home together, proof that life pulsed gently within its walls. But on the night the house grew too quiet, the silence pressed down like a velvet curtain, heavy, smothering, unnatural. The evening began like any other. Charles had coughed through supper, a dry, persistent sound that worried his mother. She measured out an extra half-teaspoon of the tonic, stirred it into his milk, and watched him drink it with trusting eyes. It soothed him quickly. His small body relaxed, and soon he lay limp in her arms, as peaceful as a painting. Upstairs, she tucked him beneath the blankets and kissed his forehead. His breath came slow and shallow, but the tonic always made him breathe that way. She told herself it was nothing unusual. Yet, when she returned to the drawing room, she found the same dense stillness waiting for her. Even the clock seemed to tick more softly. Mr. Harraway dozed in his chair, chin on his chest, spectacles still perched on his nose. The fire crackled faintly, as though reluctant to disturb the hush. Not even the familiar settling of the house, those tiny creaks of wood expanding with the warmth, made themselves known. Mrs. Harraway wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stood by the window. Outside, fog erased the lamplights, turning the street into a grey void. No horses passed, no wheels clattered. London, that restless beast of a city, seemed to have paused its breath. She told herself the quiet was a blessing. But blessings do not feel like warnings. Upstairs, Charles slept through every hour without stirring. The nurse checked on him twice, each time noting the same unnerving softness in his limbs, the same heavy fall of his chest. She whispered his name, touched his hand, even opened the window to let in the cold night air. Nothing woke him. The nurse's unease grew in her chest like frost. In the servants' quarters, the staff whispered. They noticed the stillness too. The cook swore the house had never been so quiet, not even when the family travelled to the coast last year, leaving the servants behind. The air tonight felt thick, she said, as if sound itself were being smothered. Below, Mrs. Harraway tried to rouse her husband for bed. He blinked drowsily but could not seem to remain awake long enough to stand. His body felt heavy under her touch. She wondered, just for a fleeting second, whether the tonic he'd taken earlier had been a drop too much. The thought passed as quickly as it came. The bottle on the mantelpiece glimmered in the dim firelight, as innocent as a prayer candle. The sweet scent hung in the room like a ghost. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Near midnight, the nurse descended the staircase with pale cheeks and trembling hands. "Ma'am," she whispered, "I think something is wrong." Mrs. Harraway rushed upstairs, heart pounding in her chest. The nursery felt colder than before. Charles lay still, too still, his lashes unmoving against his skin. She touched his cheek. It was warm, but his breathing was so thin, so faint, that she had to lean in close to feel it. The room tilted. The silence became a scream. She shook him gently, then harder. His head lolled, his body limp as a discarded doll. A terror she had never known seized her heart with icy fingers. "Charles, darling, wake up. Please wake up." Her voice fractured in the quiet. Downstairs, Dr. Atherton's instructions echoed faintly in her memory. A teaspoon. A little more if needed. You'll know when he needs more. But she hadn't known. How could she have known? And on that dreadful, too quiet night, the house held its breath, as if in mourning the truth revealed itself in the stillness. The medicine meant to soothe her child had lulled him into a sleep so deep he hovered between worlds. A sleep he might not wake from at all. The first night, too quiet, was only the beginning. The city would learn this silence again and again in parlours, nurseries, sick rooms, until London realised the truth too late. This sweetness was not peace, it was danger. And it had already begun its work. Morning should have brought comfort. Dawn in a London townhouse was usually a gentle affair. Pale light slipping through lace curtains, the rumble of milk carts on the street below, the familiar clang of kettles warming in the kitchen. But on this morning, none of those sounds could soften the terror that had settled in the Harroway nursery overnight like an unwelcome guest. Charles did not wake, not with the nurse's whisper, not with the rustle of blankets, not with the trembling brush of his mother's hand against his cheek. His eyelids did not flutter, not even slightly. His breathing, thin as thread, rose and fell so faintly that his mother pressed her ear to his chest for fear she was imagining it. He looked peaceful, heartbreakingly so, as though frozen in a portrait. But sleep this deep was not natural, not for a child, not for anyone. The sweet scent clung to the room like a veil. Mrs. Harroway's heartbeat hammered painfully as she backed away from the bed. Panic blurred her vision. Her fingers fumbled with the doorknob, and she called for the nurse in a voice that cracked with every syllable. "He's not waking, oh heavens! Why isn't he waking?" The nurse hurried to the bedside, lifting Charles gently. His limbs fell to his sides with unnatural softness. Her lips parted in horror. "This isn't sleep," she whispered. Yet she did not say the word both women feared. Mrs. Harroway staggered to the mantel in the nursery, where the bottle, that small, shining bottle, stood innocently. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The liquid inside shimmered with that familiar amber glow. How could something so beautiful cause harm? How could something given by a doctor, sold by a respectable apothecary, do this? By the time the doctor arrived, summoned by frantic knocking and a nearly incoherent message from the housemaid, the house had plunged into a suffocating dread. Even the servants moved in silence, as though afraid any sound might pull Charles further from the world. Dr. Atherton examined the boy carefully. Though a shadow flickered across his face early in the assessment, a shadow he tried, with moderate success, to disguise. He lifted Charles's eyelids, pressed a stethoscope to his chest, checked the pulse at the small, pale wrist. His jaw tightened. For the first time in all his years tending to the Harroway family, his confidence faltered. "How much did he take last night?" he asked quietly. Only then did Mrs. Harroway understand the weight behind the question. She described the dose 1.5 teaspoons, perhaps a touch more. He had coughed so terribly, she only meant to help him rest. Was that so wrong? She clutched her hands together, as though they might hold her together. Dr. Atherton said nothing for a long moment. He held the bottle up to the light. The amber glow reflected in his glasses, hiding his eyes. Then, in a low voice, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile stillness, he said, "There are sensitivities, rare ones. Some children respond too strongly. It is possible he requires less than the usual dose." He did not mention that reports had begun to circulate quietly among medical men, that letters had arrived at his office from colleagues describing similar cases, children who slept too long, mothers who grew faint, men who slumped in their chairs and did not rise again. He had dismissed them as exaggerations. He could not dismiss this. They worked for hours, cool cloths, fresh air, attempts to rouse him with gentle calls of his name. Nothing stirred him. By late afternoon, exhaustion hollowed the entire household. And then a miracle, or something close to it, Charles sighed. A long, tremulous sound. His eyelids fluttered faintly, his fingers curled inward, his breath deepened, just enough to give hope. Mrs. Harroway collapsed into tears. But the doctor, despite offering calming reassurances, quietly slipped the bottle into his satchel instead of returning it to the mantel. He would review its ingredients. He would inquire, discreetly, whether similar bottles were causing similar quiet tragedies elsewhere. For the first time, a seed of doubt had pierced his certainty. And outside, London's fog thickened as though listening. For Charles had survived this time, but others in the city would not. A child who does not wake is not merely a tragedy. It is a warning, one that London had only just begun to hear. Not far from the Harroway's quiet crisis, on a narrow, cobblestoned street in Clerkenwell, another household was waking to a sorrow that had already settled itself fully into the walls. The morning sun reached the windows weakly, its light dimmed by a fog that felt heavier than usual, weighted with the strange sweetness drifting from parlours across the city. Inside the Bellamy home, a woman sat on the staircase, her grief gathered around her like a second mourning veil. Mrs. Bellamy had not meant to fall asleep on the steps. She had spent the entire night beside her husband's sick bed, listening for the rattling in his chest to ease. But the night stretched on endlessly, and as the hours deepened, so did her exhaustion. At some point, she sat down halfway up the stairs, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. When she woke, morning had come, and the house was far too quiet. Her husband, a clerk known for his punctuality and gentle disposition, had taken the tonic the night before for what he assumed was a cold creeping into his lungs. "Just a dose," he had said with a weary smile, lifting the bottle with practiced familiarity, to sleep through the coughing. But the sleep had swallowed him whole. Mrs. Bellamy did not know that yet, as she sat trembling on the stairs with the chill of the stone beneath her. She only knew the house felt wrong. A silence like this did not belong in a home where life had once moved steadily, where footsteps echoed daily, where conversation filled the evenings. Now only the sweet, cloying scent drifted through the hall. She stood slowly, gripping the banister as though the wood might offer answers. Her feet felt leaden as she climbed, each stair creaking faintly under her weight. At the landing, she hesitated. The door to her husband's room was ajar, just enough to let out a faint thread of the scent, that same gentle fragrance he had breathed each night, with increasing regularity. She pushed the door open. Her husband lay as she had left him, head slightly turned, hands folded atop the blanket. His face was peaceful, almost beatific, too peaceful. She whispered his name, her voice cracking. He did not stir. She took his hand. It was warm, but heavy. She pressed her ear to his chest. Silence. It was the kind of silence that steals air from the room, a silence that feels like a presence, not an absence, a quiet that screamed. She stumbled backward, catching herself against the frame of the doorway. Her breath hitched. Her fingers clawed at her mouth, as though trying to suppress a sound too terrible to release. But the sob broke loose anyway, a low, aching sound that seeped into the walls of the modest home. The neighbours heard. They always did. In London, grief carried as easily as smoke. Soon Mrs. Harrow from next door was rushing in, her apron still dusted with flour, her expression already tightening with dread. She found the widow kneeling beside the bed, hands trembling violently as she clutched her husband's still arm. "He was only sleeping," she whispered, "only sleeping." But the bottle on the bedside table told the fuller story. Its cork lay beside it, as though plucked loose in haste or routine. The liquid inside glowed faintly, its sweetness perfuming the small room with a deceptive gentleness. Mrs. Harrow lifted it carefully, recognizing it instantly. Her own daughter had been taking the same tonic for weeks. Her stomach twisted painfully. "They say it helps," Mrs. Bellamy whispered, tears streaking her face. "They say it calms the nerves, eases the lungs." Mrs. Harrow tightened her grip on the bottle. "They say many things," she muttered. "Not all of them true." But no one dared speak such suspicions aloud. Not yet. not while doctors insisted its safety, not while advertisements praised its gentleness, not while countless Londoners clung to the relief it promised. And so Mrs. Bellamy's grief joined the quiet gathering of tragedies, spreading through the city, one still house after another, one family at a time. A widow on the stairs was not the first sign, nor would she be the last. In drawing rooms, nurseries, and sick beds, London was beginning to lose people not to disease or misfortune, but to the very medicine meant to protect them. And the sweetness in the air, faint, persistent, unmistakable, was becoming the scent of morning. London's tragedies rarely announced themselves openly. They preferred to hide in polite corners, behind lace curtains, under polished silver, or most deceptively, in the quiet drawers and mirrored cabinets of respectable homes. And in those mirror-fronted vanities, where ladies kept their perfumes and powders, another danger was gathering in secret. It looked nothing like danger. It looked like refinement. The Haraway home, still reeling from the night Charles nearly slipped away from them, held its breath in a fragile sort of calm. Dr. Atherton had taken the bottle for examination. The nurse watched Charles with wary devotion. Mrs. Haraway tiptoed through the days as though a sudden footfall might shatter her son's thin recovery. Yet even with the doctor's absence and the missing bottle, the house did not feel entirely freed from the sweetness that had nearly stolen the boy's breath. For in the master bedroom, behind the dressing-room mirror, there remained another small escape, a pale, silvery powder kept in a delicate porcelain box. It had been a gift from Mrs. Haraway's sister months earlier, a fashionable restorative imported from the continent, supposedly made of alpine herbs and elements harmonious to the female body. The advertisement spoke of it in near-poetic tones. A whisper of mountain air, a balm for the nerves, a gentle companion for restless minds. Ladies discussed it at teas and sewing circles, praising its subtlety, its lightness, its remarkable ability to soothe even the most stubborn anxieties. It was, in truth, a stronger cousin of the tonic. Mrs. Haraway did not use it often, only on days when her heart fluttered too quickly or her breath felt caught somewhere beneath her ribs, only when the world pressed too sharply against her, only when she needed to feel still. But after the terrifying night when Charles did not wake, the weight of fear had settled into her bones. Her hands trembled when she buttoned her dress. Her breath quivered when she reached for her son. Her reflection looked back at her with eyes surrounded by deepening shadows. So she opened the mirror. The porcelain box gleamed softly as she lifted it from its hiding place. The powder was faintly fragrant, almost sweet, with a whisper of the same chemical perfume that had permeated the house through the tonic. She hesitated only for a heartbeat before lifting a small spoonful to her lips and letting it dissolve on her tongue. Warmth unfurled through her instantly. Calm seeped into her limbs. Her breath quieted, and the terror, the memory of Charles's ghost-like stillness, retreated just a little. She told herself this was moderation. She told herself she needed this. She told herself every respectable woman in London used something similar. Her own sister, her friends, even the lady who lived opposite and never stepped outside without lace gloves and a parasol. It could not be harmful if so many trusted it. But the stillness it brought carried a familiar edge, a heaviness, a soft dimming of the senses that made her feel as though the world had pulled back, slightly fogged at the edges, sweet and muted. Downstairs, the nurse noticed a difference in her. "Ma'am, you seem pale," she remarked gently. "It's only nerves," Mrs. Haraway replied with a wan smile. "I slept poorly." She did not mention the powder, nor did she notice that her movements, once graceful with practiced ease, had become slower, that her voice carried a faint slur at its edges, that she drifted through the hallways with the same dreamlike softness that had overtaken Charles, that the sweetness in the air grew stronger when she passed. Across London, Women like her were doing the same, dusting spoons with the powder, trusting its delicate flavor, believing it harmless. They took it before bed to help them sleep. They took it before callers arrived to calm anxieties. They took it in secret, behind mirrors and locked drawers, their reflections staring back at them with a softness that felt almost too serene. Servants noticed first. They always did. They whispered about mistresses who walked as though floating, who forgot appointments, who drifted in and out of rooms as if guided by some unseen tide. But no one accused. No one questioned. Ladies' ailments were private, delicate things. And so, behind mirrors all over the city, powders stronger than any tonic found their way into the lives of London's most respectable households, quietly, sweetly, fatally. For every mother who took the powder used it to silence worry. Every worry silenced kept them from seeing the truth. And every spoonful deepened the quiet spell falling over the city. The sweetness behind the mirror was not a cure. It was another trap, waiting patiently for its turn. And in the Haraway home, tragedy had not left. It had simply changed its hiding place. On a corner of Great Russell Street, tucked between a tobacconist's shop and a modest bookseller, stood Pemberton and Sons Apothecary, a tidy establishment with polished windows, blue-painted trim, and a bell that chimed sweetly whenever a customer entered. Inside, rows of glass bottles lined the shelves like soldiers in gleaming ranks. Powders, tonics, syrups, draughts, the comforts of the modern age, each one promising relief, restoration, or repose. And Mr. Pemberton, with his immaculate waistcoat and carefully combed side whiskers, stood at the center of it all like a conductor of chemical miracles. He never asked questions. Not really. A mother might whisper about her child's sleepless nights. A clerk might mention an aching chest. A housemaid might say her mistress seemed overly fatigued. Mr. Pemberton nodded through every explanation with practiced solemnity, but he never asked how long the ailment had continued. He never asked how much of the remedy they already used. He never asked what else they were taking. Questions slowed business, and business was brisk. On this particular morning, Mrs. Haraway arrived with trembling hands and a pale face, clutching her purse as though someone might wrest it from her. She had come for a refill not of the tonic Dr. Atherton had confiscated, but of the milder powder sold discreetly in porcelain boxes. She told herself she needed only a small amount to steady her nerves, nothing more. The bell chimed as she stepped inside. That faint sweetness, the smell she now recognized too well, seemed to float in the apothecary itself, though it was likely nothing more than the mingled scents of the countless bottles on display. "Mrs. Haraway," Mr. Pemberton greeted warmly, his tone smooth as the labels on his shelves. "A pleasure as always. What may I do for you today?" She hesitated, in that delicate way women often did when asking for something they felt they should not need. "I require more of the restorative powder," she murmured. "Of course," he replied without the slightest pause. "A popular choice among the ladies of Bloomsbury. Very effective." He moved to the back shelf, selecting a porcelain container with the same practiced grace he used for all his stock. His hands were steady, precise. He might have been handling a bouquet of dried lavender for all the emotion he showed. "You found it helpful, I trust?" "Yes," she whispered. "Very helpful." He did not ask how much she used. He did not ask how often. He did not ask whether it made her faint or forgetful or sluggish symptoms he had recognized in others. He did not ask because he already knew. Over the past year, more and more customers had returned for increasingly frequent refills. He noticed the pallor in their faces, the heaviness in their movements, the way their eyes drifted slightly out of focus when they spoke. He observed all of it with a peculiar detachment, curious, perhaps, but never concerned. Concern interfered with commerce. He had heard rumors, of course, whispered warnings among apothecaries, Quiet notes passed between chemists hinting that something in these popular mixtures carried effects no one fully understood. But as long as no official notice had been posted, as long as customers continued to praise the products and physicians continued to prescribe them, Mr. Pemberton saw no reason to interrupt the steady flow of silver coins passing across his counter. When he placed the box into Mrs. Harroway's gloved hand, his eyes lingered a moment on her trembling fingers. "If you experience any unusual effects," he said lightly, "simply reduce the dose." It was the closest thing to caution he ever offered. She nodded gratefully, unaware she had just been given advice far too hollow to protect her. As she left, another customer entered, a maid buying a bottle on behalf of her mistress. Then a pale gentleman ordering a draught for nerves. Then a weary mother seeking something to help her teething infant sleep through the night. Mr. Pemberton filled each order without hesitation. Cork out. Bottle filled. Cork pressed in. No questions asked. The bell chimed again and again, a crisp, cheerful sound that masked the quiet dread slipping through the city like a chemical fog. Behind him, the shelves glowed with amber, ivory, and crystalline hues, beautiful, dangerous, seductive. Mr. Pemberton polished a glass jar absently, humming under his breath. He never asked why families returned more often. He never asked why their faces grew paler. He never asked why the city seemed quieter, heavier, sweeter by the week. He only asked, "Will that be all?" And as long as London answered yes, the danger would continue to flow into its homes, one bottle, one powder, one quiet tragedy at a time. The apothecaries' hands were steady. The shelves were full, and London, unknowing, walked deeper into the haze. The man who could have asked the right questions simply never did. Fog had always been a familiar companion to London, rolling in from the river with a slow, creeping grace. It softened rooftops, blurred lamplight, and clung to carriage wheels until even the cobblestones seemed to lose their sharpness. But in the winter, when the medicine spread quietly through the homes of the city, the fog seemed to take on a character of its own, thicker, sweeter, and strangely intimate, as though it carried whispers between the houses. People remarked on it without understanding. "It smells pleasant this year," merchants said as they unlocked their shops at dawn. "Almost perfumed," commented ladies stepping into their carriages. And the street sweepers, moving through the early morning murk, noticed the way the air felt warm even when frost clung to the stones. What no one realized was that the city itself had begun exhaling the byproduct of its own cure. In neighborhood after neighborhood, the sweet scent of the tonic drifted from half-open windows, spilled from bottles left uncorked overnight, and evaporated from handkerchiefs dampened with the chemical solution. It mingled with coal smoke and damp fog until the entire city carried the fragrance of a remedy that promised comfort and delivered calamity. In the Harroway household, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Mrs. Harroway, still pale from worry, tried to convince herself that the sweetness lingering in the house came only from the fireplace, from tea left cooling on the table, from the powder she took only when necessary. But on mornings when the fog crept through the cracks of the old sash windows, the scent grew stronger, too familiar, too soft, too much like the sweetness that had nearly stilled her child's breath. The nurse noticed it first. "Ma'am," she whispered one morning, drawing back the curtains, "it smells like the tonic outside." "That is impossible," Mrs. Harroway began, but the sentence faded. For the moment she opened the window a few inches to let in air. The sweetness swept inside like a sigh. From the nursery, Charles stirred, still recovering in fragile increments. The nurse shut the window quickly. Across the city, similar scenes played out. A widow in Clerkenwell opened her shutters to let in the morning breeze and nearly retched at the scent that reminded her of the bottle beside her late husband's bed. A maid hanging laundry in Southwark became dizzy after breathing too deeply. A child returning from school asked why the fog tasted like syrup. The city's physicians had begun to whisper among themselves as well. Letters circulated quietly, hidden beneath stacks of journals, describing symptoms from families across London. Sleeplessness turning into endless sleep, mild coughs turning into shallow breaths, nerves soothed into silence, but not one doctor dared to speak publicly. Not yet. To challenge the new medicines was to challenge progress itself. Apothecaries, too, could feel the shift in the air. Mr. Pemberton noticed the way customers stepped into his shop, blinking heavily. Their movements slowed. The bell over his door chimed less sharply, as though muffled by the fog. Even he, ever confident in his stock, found himself pausing occasionally to steady his hands. Yet business continued. Bottles continued to sell. The fog continued to thicken. By late winter, it had grown so dense that people described it as a blanket across the streets, a curtain over the river, a weight upon the lungs. Newspapers described it poetically, calling it London's winter veil. But the truth was far less romantic. The fog had become the city's accomplice. It carried the sweetness deeper into homes, into alleyways, into taverns and bedrooms and sick rooms. It masked the scent of danger so thoroughly that even those who suspected the medicine might be harmful could not differentiate between the city's natural haze and the fragrance that crept from the very remedies they trusted. One night, as Mrs. Harroway stood at the window watching the fog curl around the gas lamps outside, she realized it moved with an unsettling softness, almost like breath. The thought chilled her. She shut the curtains quickly, as though afraid the fog might seep into her home and settle itself beside her son's bed. But it already had. London didn't need to swallow another drop of the medicine for its effects to linger. The fog itself now carried the scent of a cure turned sinister. And soon, the city would learn that something sweet can smother just as surely as something foul. The fog was no longer merely weather. It was warning, and only a few had begun to listen. The Harroways were not the only family who had begun inviting the tonic to their supper table. Across London, in homes lit by lamps and warmed by coal fires, the evening meal had quietly transformed into something more ritualistic, more fragile, and far more dangerous than anyone dared acknowledge. Where once the dinner hour had echoed with chatter, clinking cutlery, and the comfortable noise of family life, it now carried a different sound, the soft tap of a cork being drawn out of a bottle, and the faintest sweetness drifting into the air. The Harroways, still shaken from Charles's near tragedy, attempted to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Mrs. Harroway prepared the table with extra care folded napkins, good china, silver polished until it gleamed. She hoped that the familiar order of things might soothe the tension that clung stubbornly to the household, but the tension lingered beneath the surface like an ache that refuses to fade. At the table, Charles sat propped against cushions. His face remained pale, but a fragile spark of health had begun to return. He smiled weakly at his mother. She returned the smile, though hers trembled. The nurse stayed close, hovering like a shadow. Mr. Harroway entered last, weary from a day at the counting-house. His coat smelled faintly of tobacco and fog, and something else, something sweet that clung stubbornly to London air. He took his place at the head of the table and exhaled deeply. "Perhaps some restorative would do us all good," he murmured, reaching toward the small decanter resting innocently near the bread dish. Mrs. Harroway's breath caught. They no longer had the amber bottle. Dr. Atherton still held it for examination, but the decanter contained a diluted cordial made from the same chemical mixture gifted to them months earlier. It had always been considered harmless, even fashionable among dinner hosts. She hesitated. The nurse stiffened behind Charles. Still, Mr. Harroway poured a small measure for himself, barely half a glass, and raised it to his lips. The sweetness perfumed the air, subtle yet unmistakable. He closed his eyes as he swallowed, exhaling as though the drink smoothed every fraying thread inside him. Mrs. Harroway watched him, feeling a cold unease wrap itself around her ribs. The powder she had taken earlier was beginning to settle into her limbs, softening the edges of her senses. Her thoughts drifted faintly, like paper boats on a slow-moving current. She should have stopped him. She should have swept the decanter from the table. She should have acted the moment she smelled that sweetness. But she didn't, because part of her still believed what the doctors and advertisements had promised, that these mixtures were blessings of modern science, that they soothed the nerves, that they steadied the breath, that they protected fragile health. And because she saw that same fragile calm wash across her husband's features, she found herself reaching for the decanter as well. The nurse stepped forward sharply. "Mum, should you?" The question lingered between them like a warning. "I only need a little," Mrs. Harroway whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She poured the faintest sip into her own glass. The sweetness rose, deceptively gentle. She brought it to her lips. It warmed her throat as it went down. Across the table, Charles stared at his parents with wide, uncertain eyes. He knew that smell. He remembered the dreamlike heaviness it brought. He shivered. The meal passed in subdued quiet. Conversation fluttered weakly, like candle flames fighting to survive in a draught. The clatter of forks sounded distant, as though muffled by layers of cloth. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Harroway's eyelids drooped. Soon after, Mrs. Harroway's posture softened, her gaze drifting to some indistinct point beyond the table. The nurse watched all of it with growing dread. This was not the natural fatigue of a long day, nor the peaceful relaxation of a family finally at rest. This was a slow surrender, a subtle intoxication that dulled fear, dimmed judgment, and silenced the alarms that should have rung loudly after Charles's near disaster. By the time supper ended, the Harroways moved with the same soft, dreamlike stillness that had frightened the nurse for weeks. She guided Charles to his room, her heart pounding. She had begun to see more clearly than the family themselves what was happening. The household was slipping back into a pattern that had nearly claimed the boy's life. And though she wanted to speak to warn them, she knew her voice carried little weight against the combined authority of medical men, advertisements, and a citywide trust in sweet-smelling cures. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows once more, thick and sweet as syrup. The Harroways were not alone. All over London, families were raising glasses and spoons to their lips before supper's end. A city does not fall ill all at once. It drifts, quietly, softly, one dinner table at a time. And London, wrapped in sweetness and fog, had already begun to drift. For weeks, the decanter on the supper table had been merely a quiet guest, a presence that offered comfort without asking anything in return. At least, that was how Mr. Harroway saw it. But as winter deepened and the fog thickened around London's streets, his attention turned more and more toward that delicate glass vessel, as though it held not only relief, but answers to questions he dared not voice. It began subtly, a second sip after supper, a small measure before bed. A few drops stirred into his tea when the day's numbers swam before his eyes. He told himself these were trivial indulgences, harmless, even necessary. The city pressed heavily on a man's mind. The expectations of clients, the endless ledgers, the cold corridors of the counting house where every mistake seemed echoed by the very walls. A gentleman of responsibility needed something to steady his nerves, and the cordial did steady him. It eased the knot in his chest. It smoothed the sharp edges of his thoughts. It blunted the weariness he had carried since Charles's near tragedy. But something else crept in with the relief. He began to linger at the table after meals, even after the others had gone. The servants noticed first, the way he rested his hand on the decanter with a familiarity bordering on fondness, the way he swirled the liquid and watched the light catch it like a man hypnotized. Some nights he sat alone long after the fire had waned, sipping slowly, staring into the middle distance, as though the answers to his troubles floated somewhere in the amber depths. He told himself it was only temporary. A season of strain, a simple aid until life regained its balance. But the balance slipped further every day. When he came home in the evenings, fog clinging to his coat, he reached for the cordial before he removed his gloves. The sweetness of it seemed to meet him at the door, a greeting more comforting than the polite inquiries of his household. "Just a touch," he would murmur, even as his wife watched him with a nervous tightness around her eyes. She recognized the scent too well. One night, after supper, she dared to reach across the table and touch his hand. "You must be careful," she whispered. "After what happened with Charles." He smiled, though the expression was weary. "This is not the same, my dear. This is mild, perfectly safe, and I need it for a little while." Her gaze drifted downward to the half-empty glass. She said nothing more. But the nurse, standing silently in the doorway, saw what the mistress could not. The way Mr. Harroway's hands trembled when he poured his drink, the slackness in his posture after he finished it, the dulling in his eyes, as though the world were moving farther from him each day. There were mornings when he rose late, disoriented, rubbing his temples as though waking from dreams he could not recall. At work, he made small, uncharacteristic errors. Nothing disastrous yet, but enough for his colleagues to exchange glances. When he returned home, he dismissed his fatigue as the weather, the fog, the pressure of business. Then he poured himself another measure. Soon the cordial became part of every routine. Before supper, after supper, before reading, before retiring. Sometimes he poured a second glass without realizing he had already drained the first. The danger, for him, arrived not as catastrophe but as comfort. It crept in gently, the way a blanket is drawn over someone drifting into sleep. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden illness, only a slow fading, noticed only by those who loved him. He grew softer in the eyes, slower in his speech, easier to persuade, but harder to rouse. The fog outside thickened with every passing week, and inside, the sweetness in the air grew stronger each time he uncorked the bottle. One evening, long after the others had gone to bed, the nurse descended the stairs to fetch a shawl left in the parlor. She stopped, suddenly, in the doorway. There he sat, the master of the house slouched in his chair, the cordial glass hanging loosely from one hand, the decanter nearly empty beside him. His eyes were half closed, his breath shallow. For a moment she thought he might be asleep. But then something in his stillness, an unnatural softness, a troubling slackness told her this was no ordinary doze. The sweetness filled the room like a veil. She took a step closer, heart pounding. "Sir?" she whispered. He did not answer. The bottle had not harmed him all at once. It had taken him slowly, softening him sip by sip, stealing his strength under the guise of solace. And though he would wake this time, London was already becoming a city of husbands, wives, and children who lingered too long at their bottles. A city breathing sweetness, a city unraveling quietly, one glass at a time. In every household touched by the tonic or the powder, there came a point when the body began to forget its natural rhythms. Hunger, once a simple signal, faded into the quiet haze that settled over its victims. And in the Harroway home, it was Mrs. Harroway who succumbed first. It began with small things. A missed breakfast because she'd risen late and felt too faint to bother. A half-eaten luncheon because her stomach fluttered oddly. A supper picked at politely, though she pushed food around her plate more than she consumed it. At first, no one questioned her. Ladies in Victorian London often ate sparingly. It was considered refined. Pale cheeks and delicate appetites were signs of gentle breeding. But the nurse saw more. She saw the way the mistress's hands shook, not with daintiness but with weakness. She saw the hollow deepening beneath the woman's eyes, and she saw, too clearly, how the decline worsened after each discreet spoonful of powder dissolved beneath her tongue. For Mrs. Harroway, the powder offered something food could not: ease, quiet, forgetfulness. A spoonful in the morning steadied her trembling hands. A pinch in the afternoon softened her anxieties. A bit before bed dulled the echoes of fear that still haunted her from the night Charles almost slipped away. But with each dose, her appetite receded like a tide pulling slowly from the shore. One morning, as fog pressed thickly against the windows, the nurse brought her a tray of tea and buttered toast. The scent of the toast filled the room, warm, comforting, familiar. But when Mrs. Harroway lifted a piece to her lips, her throat constricted as if rejecting the very idea of nourishment. She set it down with a tremulous sigh. "I cannot bear it," she whispered. "Food feels heavy. It sits wrong." "It is because you've eaten too little," the nurse murmured gently. "Your strength is going." Mrs. Harroway managed a weak smile. No, I am simply overwrought. The powder helps. Truly." But her words lacked conviction. They drifted into the air like faint wisps of breath, dissolving before they reached the nurse's ears. Soon, even tea tasted strange to her, floral notes muddled by the lingering sweetness of the powder. Broth felt too rich, bread too rough, fruit too sharp. Her body seemed to crave only the soft chemical fog that dulled her stomach's protests and replaced hunger with a floating sense of lightness. And light she became. Her corsets no longer needed tightening. Her dresses hung loosely at the shoulders. The servants whispered about how their mistress moved through the hallways with ghost-like quiet, as though her feet barely touched the floor. Mr. Harroway noticed none of it. His own senses dulled by the cordial, his gaze fogged by the sweetness he inhaled daily, his mind softened by the comfort he clung to desperately. He looked at his wife and saw only paleness, which he attributed to worry. He suggested more rest, more sitting, more calm evenings. Never once did he consider that something inside their home was draining his wife's vitality. One evening, the family gathered for supper. The candles flickered softly, casting golden halos over the table. Charles pushed his food around, still recovering his own strength. Mr. Harroway drank from his cordial glass with a sigh of relief, and Mrs. Harroway merely sat. She lifted no fork, no knife, no sip of tea. Her hands rested on the tablecloth, palms pale as bone china. Her eyes gazed into the middle distance, unfocused, as though listening to a sound only she could hear. "Ma'am?" the nurse asked gently. "Will you not eat?" The question pulled her back like a tug on a silk thread. She blinked, startled. I forgot," she said softly. "I forgot to feel hungry. Forgot to feel hungry." The words hung in the air with a terrible fragility. Hunger was not something one forgot. It was something one lost piece by piece when the body was tricked into believing it no longer needed life's simplest fuel. The nurse pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to speak truth too boldly. Mrs. Harroway touched her lips absently, as though surprised by their trembling. She reached for the powder box beneath her shawl, thinking no one saw. The nurse did, and her heart clenched. A woman who stops eating does not fade dramatically. She dissolves slowly, quietly, elegantly, as London preferred its tragedies. And in a city where the air itself carried a sweetness that dulled thought and appetite alike, Mrs. Harroway's decline was not unique. She was only one of many women drifting into softness, paleness, frailty, their hunger blotted out by powders and tonics that stole from them silently, their vitality traded for calm. And as winter deepened, the sweetness filling London's fog would ensure that many more forgot to feel hungry at all. In Victorian London, children lived in a world curated by adults, seen but not heard, present but seldom understood. Their routines were arranged for them, their fears soothed for them, and, increasingly, their ailments medicated for them. A child's cough, a child's restlessness, a child's sleepless night, each became a tiny doorway through which the tonic slipped deeper into London's homes. And it entered most easily through the gentlest of rituals, the measured teaspoon given with a mother's trembling care. In the Haraway household, Charles's teaspoon became a ceremony. The nurse insisted they stop after the night he nearly failed to wake. But habit, fear, and the lure of calm are powerful persuaders, especially to weary parents who watch their child breathe with anxious eyes. So the tonic returned, though in diluted form, administered cautiously, hesitantly, almost guiltily. 1/2 teaspoon only, the nurse said firmly, her lips pressing tight. Yes, Mrs. Haraway whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Yet even a 1/2 teaspoon had the same sweet fragrance, the same soft shimmer, the same deceptive promise. Charles did not protest it. He trusted anything held by his mother. Children seldom suspect poison when it is given with love. The spoon, small, silver, edges worn smooth by years of stirring porridge and broth, became the vessel through which danger travelled. The nurse measured the dose carefully, the liquid catching the lamplight as she tilted the bottle with utmost restraint. She let it settle in the curve of the spoon, never once letting it overflow. Her hands shook, but she steadied them. A nurse could not show fear when a child was watching. Charles opened his mouth obediently, though the sweetness was no longer a novelty. It coated his tongue the moment it touched his lips, faint, floral, deceptively soft. He swallowed, and once more the tonic slid gently into his small body. At first, nothing seemed amiss. His breathing steadied. The cough dimmed to a soft, dry whisper. His eyelids drooped, though not as dramatically as before. The nurse watched him carefully, staying by his bedside for a full hour to ensure he did not slip too deeply into that terrifying stillness. He didn't. He slept lightly, breathing just enough, his small hand curled loosely at his side. But over the following days, subtle changes began to bloom. He tired more quickly during play. His laughter, normally bright, ringing, full of childhood's spark, grew softer, almost hesitant. He reached for his toys with half-hearted interest, and once, when asked if he was hungry, he paused as though searching for the answer rather than feeling it. The tonic was still in him, not enough to silence him as it once had, but enough to dim his brightness. Mrs. Haraway saw it. The nurse saw it. Even Mr. Haraway, dulled by his own indulgence in the cordial, noticed it in fleeting moments of clarity. Yet the teaspoon persisted, because the alternative, the cough returning, the nights of fear and breathlessness felt worse. Fear is a strong persuader. It blots out memory, reason, even instinct. And so the family clung to the tonic, convinced that smaller doses made it safe. Meanwhile, London's other children were receiving even more. In poorer districts, mothers poured the tonic freely to silence crying infants, while they worked long hours sewing in cramped rooms. In wealthier homes, nurses dosed fretful children to avoid disturbing the household's delicate reputation for refinement. The medicine became a universal tool for quieting the young. The measured teaspoon was not just routine, it was expectation. Charles grew paler as the winter weeks passed. His eyes shimmered with a distant shine, as though he were looking through, rather than at, the world around him. His limbs grew heavy, his steps slower. When he climbed into his mother's lap, it took him longer to settle. His voice softened into a fragile whisper. "I'm tired, Mama," he said one afternoon. "Then rest, darling," she replied, brushing his hair softly. But the nurse stiffened. Children should not be tired always. Not like this. Not from coughs alone. She watched him drift off again, too quickly, too easily, and as she wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, her eyes filled with a quiet, aching dread. It was not the cough that was stealing him. It was the cure. She looked at the spoon resting on the bedside table, still glinting faintly with a trace of sweetness. And for the first time, she wondered whether the greatest danger in the Haraway home was not illness, nor fog, nor winter's chill, but that small, polished spoon, waiting for the next measured dose. London's children were slipping into quietness, and no one yet realized that the silence of a child is always a cry in disguise. Every London street had at least one house that seemed unnaturally still, a place where curtains remained drawn longer than their neighbors, where the lamps were lit later than usual, where footsteps grew rare and whispers rarer. In Bloomsbury, that house was the Haraways. By the middle of winter, their home no longer resembled a place of living rhythms. It had begun to resemble something suspended between waking and dream. The first to notice the change was the milk boy. He knocked each morning, calling out in the cheerful tone expected of his trade. But no one came promptly anymore. Some days the nurse answered, her hair unpinned, her eyes shadowed. Other days it was the maid, blinking as though she'd been roused from sleep only moments before. And only once Mr. Haraway himself opened the door, his vest askew and his breath sweet with the telltale scent of the cordial. He apologized with unusual softness, as though he was speaking through a thick fog. The boy hurried away, unsettled. Inside, the house slept. The quiet no longer came only at night. It settled into the daytime hours too, slipping into corners and drifting down hallways like a sluggish draught. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed slower, as if time itself moved reluctantly within the walls. Breakfast grew later each day. Supper drifted toward midnight. Sleep overtook the household in waves. Mrs. Haraway began rising long past morning light, her limbs heavy, her head fogged with the remnants of the powder she told herself she took only when necessary. The nurse knocked softly on her door each day. "Ma'am, shall I bring tea?" Her voice was careful, too careful, as though afraid the mistress might crumble under the weight of ordinary conversation. "Yes." In a moment came the faint reply. Always the same, always barely audible. But the moments stretched endlessly. Often the nurse found her mistress still in bed hours later, her face pale, her breathing delicate, her fingers curled loosely as though grasping something in a dream she could not escape. Mr. Haraway fared little better. Some evenings he returned from work, hung up his coat, and promptly fell asleep in the parlour chair before removing his boots. Other nights he drank a measured glass of cordial or two until the world softened enough for him to drift into a stupor that resembled rest only in shape, not substance. He began missing appointments, forgetting names, staring absently at the fire as though waiting for it to speak. As for Charles, his young body surrendered most easily. Children are not meant to sleep, so much sleep is meant to restore, not consume. Yet Charles drifted into slumber at the slightest quiet moment. The nurse found him curled on the staircase one afternoon, his small frame limp, his cheek pressed to the polished wood. "Oh, my darling," she whispered, gathering him into her arms. "This is not right." But her protests met resistance. Mrs. Haraway insisted he was simply recovering. Mr. Haraway muttered that the boy had always been delicate. Dr. Atherton sent word of no cause for alarm, though he had grown oddly evasive in his explanations since taking the original tonic bottle away. Still, the nurse saw what they did not. She saw how the house breathed quieter each week, how laughter, even faint laughter, no longer rose from the rooms, how the air itself seemed heavy with unspent dreams. She tried to keep the family awake, bustling through rooms, opening curtains, stoking fires, but the warmth only lulled them deeper. She opened windows, but the fog outside was just as soporific, carrying that faint, troubling sweetness that mingled too seamlessly with the fragrance of the household medicines. And so the house slept, and slept, and slept, until the neighbors began to whisper, "Are they unwell? They keep such strange hours. That house feels tired, doesn't it? In Victorian London, where gossip travelled faster than post, rumours soon clung to the Harroway residents like ivy. But no one guessed the truth. No one understood that the family was not ill in the traditional sense. They were being slowly lulled, seduced into a sleep from which it grew harder each week to return. Some houses echo with life. Others echo with loneliness. But the Harroway house echoed with something far more troubling. The quiet sound of a family drifting further from the world carried deeper each day into a sweetness that numbed their hunger, blurred their thoughts, softened their limbs, and silenced their will. It was not a home anymore. It was a cradle, rocking itself gently toward ruin. In every Victorian household where harm crept in quietly, it was never the family who recognized danger first. Respectable men and women lived within walls cushioned by gentility, trusting doctors, prescriptions, and anything bottled with a printed label. But servants, those unseen sentinels of domestic life, moved through a home's every shadow. They noticed things their employers never would. And in the Harroway home, it was the housemaid, Lily, who first understood that something had begun to rot beneath the sweetness drifting through the air. Lily was no more than 19, small and quick-footed, with clever eyes that missed nothing. She had come from a long line of housemaids and laundresses, women whose instincts had been honed in tight quarters where secrets floated like dust. In her months of service to the Harroways, she had learned their rhythms better than they knew themselves. She knew the creak of the third stair, the exact hour the nurse rose, the meticulously even brushstrokes in Mrs. Harroway's handwriting, and she knew when those rhythms broke. The first sign came one morning when she entered the parlour to sweep the hearth. Mr. Harroway sat asleep in his chair, the embers barely alive in the grate. His coat was still on, his shoes still tied. The decanter beside him was half empty, its cork abandoned on the floor like a forgotten thought. "Sir," she whispered. He didn't stir. For a moment she froze, fearing the worst. Only when his breath shuddered faintly did she release the breath she hadn't realized she held. She draped a blanket over him and slipped away without waking him, though a knot of unease had already begun to tighten in her chest. The second sign came 2 days later. She found Mrs. Harroway asleep at her writing desk, head resting on her arm, a letter unfinished beneath her hand. The ink had pooled into a small blot where the pen had fallen. On the floor beside her chair lay the porcelain powder box, its lid slightly ajar. Lily lifted the mistress gently, helping her into a more comfortable position. Mrs. Harroway murmured something indistinct, too soft to make sense of, before drifting back into that unnatural sleep. By the end of the week, Lily's unease had transformed into dread. The household no longer woke with the sun. The nurse seemed worn to the bone, dark circled eyes flickering with worry she would not voice openly. Charles drifted through the hours like a child made of paper, folding into sleep wherever he happened to be. And Mr. Harroway, once a man precise in his habits, moved through the house as though wrapped in wool, fogging the air behind him with the faint sweetness of the cordial he drank more regularly now. Lily spoke to the cook, a stout woman with little patience for foolishness. But even cook had noticed. "They're fading," she muttered one afternoon while kneading dough. "Mark my words, fading like flowers left too long in a vase. And it's all that stuff they've been taking." "But the doctor gave it to them," Lily whispered. "And the apothecary says it's safe." "Then the doctor's blind, and the apothecary's a fool," Cook snapped. "Or worse." Lily carried those words with her like pebbles in her apron pocket, weighty, impossible to ignore. Then came the moment she could no longer stay silent. She was dusting the nursery shelves when she noticed Charles slumped in the window seat, a book open on his lap. His eyes were closed, his chest rising in slow, fragile movements. His skin had taken on a translucent pallor, veins faintly visible at his temples. "Master Charles," she whispered. He didn't answer. She touched his shoulder gently. He slid sideways, limp as a rag doll. Fear surged like cold water in her veins. She called for the nurse, her voice trembling. The nurse rushed in, lifting the boy into her arms, her expression revealing what she dared not say. "It's happening again." Lily watched, hands clasped to her chest, as they worked to rouse him. When he finally stirred weakly, faintly, the relief was sharp enough to hurt. Later that night, when the house had settled into its too familiar hush, Lily stood alone at the foot of the staircase. She inhaled deeply. The sweetness in the air, once barely noticeable, now clung to the wallpaper, the curtains, even her own apron. She whispered into the quiet, "This house is sleeping too much." And though no one answered, the wallpaper seemed to exhale in agreement. Servants in London were used to seeing the cracks in their employers' illusions, but this was different. Something insidious had woven itself into the Harraways' daily life, turning their home into a place where dreams lingered too long and waking came too late. Lily knew what the others didn't dare consider. The family wasn't merely unwell, they were being quietly undone. And she, the least powerful person in the house, was the first to see it clearly. The question was whether anyone would listen before the sweetness stole them entirely. Doctors in Victorian London prided themselves on certainty. They wore it like a waistcoat, buttoned tightly, polished daily, displayed with confidence in every gesture. Illness was to be identified. Symptoms were to be classified. Remedies were to be prescribed with authority. To admit doubt was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place in a profession that claimed dominion over the mysteries of the human body. Yet Dr. Atherton, upright, silver-haired, always composed, was beginning to feel the threads of certainty unravel in his hands. The first unraveling came in the form of letters. Thin envelopes slipped under his office door bearing the elegant signatures of fellow physicians. Their contents were polite but troubled, the words carefully arranged as though afraid to reveal too much too quickly. "I've encountered a peculiar stillness in several patients. Another child slept far too deeply after the recommended dose. The mother reports fainting spells after using the restorative powder." Dr. Atherton stacked these letters neatly on his desk. He reread them often, though never in front of colleagues. His pride forbade it. The second unravelling came with the bottle he had taken from the Harraway household. It sat now on his shelf, a small, amber thing glowing softly in the lamplight. He had meant to analyze it immediately, to reassure himself of its harmlessness. Instead, it had become an object he avoided touching, as though some unspoken dread clung to its glass walls. The third unravelling arrived in flesh and breath. It was Charles. When the nurse summoned him with urgent knocking, Dr. Atherton rushed to the Harraways' home with a sense of dread curled like a tight knot in his stomach. He had hoped, prayed even in his private way, that the boy's earlier brush with the tonic had been an anomaly, a rare sensitivity, an unfortunate reaction. But when he saw Charles slumped against the nurse's shoulder, breathing shallowly, lips faintly pale, limbs heavy, his confidence cracked like porcelain dropped on marble. He knelt at the bedside, pressing his stethoscope to the boy's chest. The heartbeat was there, but drowsy, slowed, wrapped in a drowsiness that no fever could cause. He checked the pupils. He tested the reflexes. He listened. He smelled the faint sweetness still clinging to the boy's breath. Mrs. Harraway hovered nearby, her face a fragile mask of worry. "Doctor, why does this keep happening?" He opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in his career, he found the truth lodged somewhere between ignorance and denial. "I cannot say for certain," he murmured. The words felt foreign, as though spoken by someone else. The nurse stiffened, shocked to hear a physician confess uncertainty. Mrs. Harraway's hands flew to her mouth. Dr. Atherton cleared his throat, as if hoping to gather the scattered remnants of his authority. "It may be a sensitivity," he added quickly, "a reaction to the tonic stronger than expected. Rare, of course, very rare. But you prescribed it, the nurse whispered before she could stop herself. The doctor's jaw tightened. Yes, he said carefully, and in my experience it has never caused harm in the recommended doses. But he knew that wasn't true anymore. Not after the letters, not after the whispers from chemists, not after the quiet tragedies he'd heard murmured in undertones at the medical society, and not after seeing Charles like this again. He stood slowly, smoothing his coat as though decorum could shield him from doubt. I will consult with colleagues, he said. There may be new findings, undisclosed ones. But even as he spoke, he avoided meeting the nurse's eyes. She saw too much. She had witnessed the family's decline long before the doctor admitted anything was amiss. As Dr. Atherton gathered his instruments, the housemaid, Lily, lingered in the hallway. She watched him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had seen her master stumble through the parlour, her mistress fade at the writing desk, young Charles collapse without warning. "You must stop giving it to them," Lily whispered when he passed her. Her voice was shaking, but steady with truth. Dr. Atherton froze. "Child," he said sternly, "you must not meddle in matters beyond your training." She lifted her chin. "Someone must." The doctor faltered. "Just slightly." "Just enough?" But he continued on, stepping out into the thick London fog, his coat gathering the sweetness of the air as if it wished to cling to him. As he walked away from the Haraway house, the letters in his mind rustled like accusatory ghosts. He, a man of science and certainty, could no longer explain what was happening. Not to himself, not to the families, not to London. And the medicine he had once praised now hung around his thoughts like a chemical mist he could not escape. The truth was growing quietly, steadily, terrifyingly. The city trusted him. The families trusted him. But he no longer trusted himself. And in Victorian London, a doctor who could not explain was more dangerous than any illness. Londoners trusted newspapers in a way they trusted almost nothing else. Doctors could err. Apothecaries could be mistaken. Rumours could twist themselves into frightening shapes. But the printed word crisp ink pressed into coarse paper at dawn felt solid, official, undeniable. So when the first troubling report appeared, quietly nestled between advertisements for patent elixirs and notices of society engagements, it was impossible for the city to pretend it hadn't seen it. The Haraways did not see it first. It was the milk boy again, arriving before sunrise with his chilled bottles slung over his shoulder. He liked to skim the discarded newspapers left on doorsteps as he worked stories of fog, of crime, of Parliament, anything more interesting than the monotony of his rounds. That morning, one article made him pause. Child found unresponsive after household tonic. Mother claims medicine forced him into dangerous sleep. Authorities investigating composition of popular calming remedies. He frowned, unsure what unresponsive meant, but frightened all the same. He folded the paper under his arm and moved on, the headline whispering at him like a shadow following close behind. In the Haraway home, Lily found the same paper lying on the front steps when she went out to shake dust from the doormat. She lifted it curiously. Her eyes skimmed, searching for gossip of the Queen, or news from abroad, or updates on the Collar Awards. Then she froze. There it was, the same headline. Her breath caught. The page trembled in her hands. She scanned the article feverishly. A child in Lambeth, after several evenings of medicated assistance, fell into a prolonged sleep that caused significant alarm. The family physician, when questioned, denied wrongdoing, but admitted the tonic may have been misunderstood in dosage. The apothecary involved has declined to comment. Lily's stomach turned. It was happening elsewhere, not just here, not just Charles. She folded the paper tightly, tucking it beneath her apron as though it were contraband. Inside the house, the scene was its usual troubling quiet. Mrs. Haraway remained abed past breakfast. Mr. Harroway had not risen yet at all. The nurse was tending to Charles, who drifted in and out of a thin, fragile wakefulness. Lily held the newspaper as though it were burning her fingers. She could not ignore it. Not after last night. Not after finding Mr. Harroway pale and slumped over his desk, or watching Mrs. Harroway wander the hall at dusk, her steps unsteady, her eyes glazed. She knocked softly on the nurse's door. "Come in," the nurse called, her voice tired. Lily entered, clutching the folded paper. "You must read this," she whispered. The nurse glanced up, brow furrowing. But when she took the paper and saw the headline, her expression transformed into something tight and cold, like porcelain cracking beneath sudden heat. "Oh God," she breathed. She read every word twice. Her lips pressed together in a thin, grim line. "This is exactly what's been happening here," Lily whispered. The nurse looked at Charles, pale, quiet, far too still, and her eyes filled with a fierce, frightened resolve. "We must tell Mrs. Harroway," she said. But when they brought her the paper, she stared at it as though it were written in a language she barely recalled. She held it delicately, her hands trembling, her mind fogged from the powder dissolving slowly in her blood. "They exaggerate in these journals," she murmured, though her voice shook. "The papers thrive on scandal." But then her gaze locked on one sentence near the bottom. "Households report symptoms including excessive sleep, diminished appetite, weakness of the limbs, and a troubling quietness preceding collapse." Her breath hitched. Weakness. No appetite. Quietness. Collapse. Every word felt aimed at her home, at her husband, at her child, at herself. The paper slid from her grasp. The nurse caught it before it touched the floor. Silence filled the room, a silence unlike the drugged hush that had smothered the household for weeks. This silence was sharper, a silence that trembled with realization. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, turning the glass milky, and beneath that fog, other households were reading the same article. Other families were beginning to wonder. Other servants were whispering. This was not a single tragedy. It was a pattern, a shadow spreading across London, one household at a time. And though the report was small, barely more than a column, it was enough. Enough to break the illusion of safety. Enough to stir doubt where trust had once lived. Enough to make the Harroways realize that the medicine soothing their lives might instead be quietly unraveling them. The paper did not yet name the danger. Not fully. Not boldly. But its whisper was louder than the sweetness in the air. London had been warned. Whether it chose to listen was another matter. Londoners learned to fear epidemics long before they ever understood medicine. They feared cholera because it struck quickly, consumption because it lingered cruelly, typhus because it killed without dignity. But the newest wave of losses arrived with none of the familiar signs, no fever, no rash, no trembling fits. Only quiet homes, quiet beds, and quiet graves. And so, the city found itself facing a tragedy that felt uncanny in its stillness. If illness is a storm, this was a snowfall, soft, gradual, and devastating, only when one finally looked outside and saw how deep it had gotten. In churchyards scattered across Bloomsbury, Clerkenwell, Lambeth, and Marylebone, sextons began noticing an unsettling pattern. Families who had once believed themselves blessed with longevity now stood clustered beside fresh graves far too often. The ground closest to the path, usually reserved for the elderly or those taken by influenza, now held children, young mothers, pale-faced clerks, women who had seemed healthy only days before. At St. Bartholomew's churchyard, the gravedigger, Mr. Berridge, shook his head as he dug yet another small grave. "Another child?" the vicar asked quietly, stepping up beside him. "Aye," Berridge muttered. "Third this fortnight, and two of the mothers look half dead themselves." He said nothing of the sweet scent he had noticed on some of the shrouds. A faint perfume, not floral but chemical, cloying. He had smelled it often enough while burying the wealthy, but now it drifted in from all corners of the city. Back in the Haraway home, Lily sat in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she read the day's obituary column, a morbid habit she'd never had before, but now could not stop. Names blurred together: infant son, beloved daughter, unexpectedly departed, peaceful passing at home. She recognized surnames from her walks to market, from families who once bustled with life. Something was tightening around the city, something no one dared to name. The nurse noticed it too. One morning, while walking to fetch fresh linens, she passed two women outside the church gates. They clutched their shawls tightly, speaking in low, frightened voices. "They said he went to bed early," one whispered. "Simply tired. They found him cold by morning." "Mine stopped waking for breakfast," the other replied. "Just slowed, like a candle guttering." Both women paused when the nurse approached, their eyes clouded with a fear that recognized its own reflection. Inside the Haraway home, the fear seeped deeper each day. Charles remained pale and listless. The nurse watched him sleep with one hand pressed lightly to his chest, counting every breath. She would not let him drift too deeply again, not if she could help it. But it was his parents whose slow deterioration frightened her most. Mr. Haraway had grown so dependent on the cordial that his evenings blurred into soft stupors. His once sharp mind, the pride of his profession, now wandered like a lantern flickering in a draught. He forgot entire conversations. He stood in doorways, unsure why he'd entered the room. And he slept for hours at his desk, head heavy on his arms. Mrs. Haraway fared no better. The powder behind her mirror had become her quiet refuge from fear. She swallowed it in tiny doses, only enough to take the edge off, but even tiny doses gathered in the blood like mist gathers on glass. Soon her steps grew unsteady. Her appetite waned completely. Some days she did not notice Charles's soft calls for her. "We must stop giving them these things," the nurse whispered to Lily one night. Her voice trembled with urgency. "We must." "But how?" Lily whispered back. "They don't listen. The doctor doesn't listen. No one listens to girls like us." Yet they both knew the alternative. If nothing changed, the Haraways might soon join those families filling the churchyard. That terrible thought turned the nurse's stomach. Across the city, funerals multiplied. Black-plumed carriages rolled steadily through fog-choked streets. Coffin-makers worked through supper hours. Ministers felt a new heaviness settling into their voices as they repeated prayers for the same kinds of deaths. Peaceful, unexpected, without suffering. Only the servants, those who washed the bodies, changed the linens, and cleaned the quiet rooms, knew there was nothing peaceful about the growing stillness overtaking London's homes. They whispered it to one another in kitchens, laundry houses, and narrow alleyways. "It's the medicine. It must be. It's killing them softly." The papers had begun to hint at it. The doctors had begun to fear it. The apothecaries had begun to tighten their lips. And the family plot, not just in the Haraway story, but across the entire city, was filling too quickly. Something sweet was rotting London from the inside out. And, unless someone acted soon, the earth would continue to open quiet, soft, and hungry to receive its next victims. Suspicion does not enter a Victorian city like a trumpet blast. It seeps in like damp quietly, persistently, staining every wall before anyone notices. And in London, suspicion began to gather in the corners of drawing rooms, the whispers of servants, the hurried glances exchanged in apothecaries. It began not with outrage, but with unease, that subtle, stomach-turning feeling that something trusted had turned treacherous. The fog that winter seemed thicker than any the city had known in years. But beneath the usual coal smoke and river chill, Londoners began noticing a second, sweeter scent, faint but unmistakable. a ghost of the very medicines they had been pouring into their homes. The air felt wrong, the streets felt muted. Those who ventured outside in the early mornings spoke of a drowsiness in the air, as though the city itself had taken a dose too strong. It was in this strange atmosphere that suspicion first took root. At first it came in murmurs. A maid from Clerkenwell telling her cousin in Camden that 3 houses on their street had fallen too quiet. A charwoman in Lambeth whispering that her employer, once robust, now drifted through the days in a daze, spooning calming powder into her tea like sugar. A widow in Hackney confiding in the grocer that her husband had slipped away in his sleep after weeks of using a tonic he believed harmless. But no one wanted to say the word poison. The Victorians trusted bottles, they trusted labels, they trusted progress. To accuse a medicine of wrongdoing felt like accusing modernity itself. Still, a shift was happening. The nurse in the Haraway household felt it most keenly. She had fought silently for weeks against the powder, against the cordial, against the dangerous calm that wrapped itself around the family like a shroud. But she had been alone in her concern until now. Now the city was beginning to mutter the same questions that had haunted her since the night Charles nearly slipped into death. One morning, while she walked to the market for bread, she overheard 2 men speaking outside the butcher's shop. "That boy in Lambeth," one said, lowering his voice. "The one who wouldn't wake." "Aye," the other replied. "I heard the mother use that tonic, the one with the blue label." The nurse tightened her grip on her basket. "It's not just Lambeth," the first man continued. "There's a family in Holborn, father, mother, daughter, all taken ill in the same week. Same bottle in their kitchen." The butcher, overhearing, leaned forward. "You ask me, they ought to pull the stuff off the shelves." "But they won't," the second man grumbled. "Not unless someone dies in public." Someone had died dozens, perhaps more, but they had died privately, silently, inside respectable homes with curtains drawn. And polite society did not accuse medicine of murder unless absolutely forced. As the nurse walked back to the Haraway home, she noticed others moving slower than usual. A woman paused on her doorstep, clutching her shawl as though uncertain whether she felt cold or simply weak. A man leaned on a lamppost, his cheeks sunken, his breath shallow. Children dragged their feet through the fog, tired yet restless, their mothers' hands trembling as they held them close. It dawned on her, with chilling clarity, that it was not just the Haraways who were fading. It was not just their house that slept too much. It was London. Inside the Haraway home, she found Lily reading the newspaper again, her eyes wide. "There's another article," Lily whispered. "Another child, and a mother this time." The nurse glanced over her shoulder to ensure Mrs. Haraway was not listening. "Does it say what they were using?" Lily nodded. "The same sort of tonic. And a powder." The nurse's stomach tightened. She folded the paper slowly, as though laying a shroud over something no one wanted to acknowledge. "They're beginning to see it," she said. "But suspicion is not certainty." The city was beginning to suspect, yes, but suspicion alone did not stop the bottles from selling or the powders from dissolving on tongues. It did not stop the apothecaries from offering remedies with polished smiles, or the doctors from reassuring anxious families with well-practiced confidence. The nurse looked toward the staircase leading to Charles's room. The sweetness still clung to the walls, like a scent that refused to be scrubbed away. London was stirring. London was whispering. London was beginning to fear. But fear had not yet turned into action. And until it did, the city would continue to drift deeper into the drowsy, deadly quiet that had already claimed so many. The danger was no longer a secret, but neither was it fully believed. Suspicion is the first step toward truth, and in a city wrapped in fog and sweetness, that first step was long overdue. Few Londoners ever saw the laboratories hidden behind apothecary shop fronts. They were places of quiet alchemy, of glass and metal gleaming under the soft light of gas lamps, of the chemical tang of herbs and compounds mingling with ether, alcohol, and the faintest trace of something unknown. To the casual observer, the shop fronts appeared polite, respectable shelves lined with bottles, a bell above the door, a polished counter for exchanging silver coins. But behind that veneer, the city's quiet tragedy was being compounded. At Pemberton and Sons, the laboratory stretched behind the orderly shelves of tonics and powders, a small room of marble-topped tables, jars of dried botanicals, and instruments whose purposes only the most learned could name. Here, the sweet tonics and powders that floated through Bloomsbury homes were born, measured, and bottled with meticulous care. Mr. Pemberton himself often lingered here long after the shop was closed, ensuring each mixture was exactly as it should be. He prided himself on precision. He prided himself on consistency. He prided himself on the trust of the city. Yet precision and trust were not the same as foresight. The laboratory smelled faintly of clove and camphor, with a hint of something sharper, chemical, almost imperceptible, like the distant bite of frost in an otherwise mild morning. Mr. Pemberton moved among the bottles with the careful grace of a man dancing with invisible partners. Each compound he measured, each teaspoon he poured, was recorded in neat, looping script, catalogued with care, noted with pride. And yet, none of it could predict what the medicine would do when it left this controlled space and entered the homes of families like the Harraways. He worked late into the night, candles flickering, shadows stretching across the tiled floor. The bottles sat in their ranks, waiting for orders, while he tested solutions, stirred powders, adjusted concentrations. He thought in terms of chemistry, of reactions, of dosages. He thought in terms of science. He did not think of fainting mothers, of children who drifted into endless sleep, of husbands who lingered at the glass as though it offered more than warmth. And yet, each adjustment he made affected more than molecules. It rippled through the city in silence. Each teaspoon dispensed, each powder measured, carried a weight invisible to him, but no less real. On a particularly fog-heavy evening, Mr. Pemberton paused before a freshly bottled tonic. He inhaled the sweet scent rising from the glass and felt a rare pang of unease. The aroma reminded him of his own daughter, sleeping fitfully in her room 2 streets away. He shook the thought away, attributing it to fatigue and the city's ever-present fog. He did not consider that the same sweetness would find its way into the air of homes across London, settling in nurseries, parlours, and bedrooms like a ghostly companion. He stirred the solution once more, letting the glass catch the candle light. It shimmered with the same amber glow that would soon greet families at the supper table. It promised calm. It promised rest. It promised nothing of the quiet peril it carried. In this small, hidden room behind the polite shop front, the machinery of domestic tragedy turned steadily onward. Measurements, bottles, and corks, all carefully catalogued, all carefully prepared, all unknowingly complicit. Meanwhile, London slept unaware. Houses like the Harraways exhaled drowsy sighs into the streets. Curtains swayed gently in the fog, footsteps were fewer, laughter was softer, and the faint chemical sweetness that had been prepared with care in laboratories like Pemberton and Sons drifted beyond the walls into hallways, nurseries, and bedrooms, carrying the promise of repose and the quiet, insidious toll of its other nature. Mr. Pemberton, intent on his craft, did not hear it. He did not smell it. He did not see the ripple it caused in the households he considered his loyal clientele. Science, measured carefully and administered politely, had already begun to write London's newest tragedy, and the city had no inkling that it had been authored behind the glass, in the quiet hum of a laboratory no one would ever see. In Victorian London, a miracle need not be divine to be believed. It could be bottled, measured, and sold in the polite confines of an apothecary shop. And so it was with the tonic and powders that had taken residence in the Haraway household and countless others like it. Mothers whispered of their efficacy, fathers nodded with cautious relief, and children accepted them obediently. The miracle, as everyone called it, promised calm. It promised sleep. It promised the quiet stability of the home that no one had dared imagine could be purchased. Mrs. Haraway believed it instantly. After the night her son had nearly slipped beyond her reach, she welcomed the tonic as a small savior. Each teaspoon was administered with a mixture of fear and reverence, the sweet aroma curling through the nursery like a whispered benediction. She watched Charles's shallow breaths deepen and his fragile body soften in repose, and she felt, for a fleeting moment, that the worst had been averted. Neighbours spoke of the same miracle with hushed delight. At tea in the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, ladies compared experiences. One mother's child, who slept soundly for the first time in weeks, another whose cough faded into gentle murmurs. Words were chosen carefully, always tempered with gratitude, always framed in the polite vocabulary of social decorum. No one spoke of danger. Danger was neither fashionable nor comprehensible to the genteel society that clung to propriety above all else. The apothecaries encouraged the belief. Their polished counters and gleaming bottles promised order, precision, and reliability. Each label bore confident assertions, safe for all ages, gentle yet effective, endorsed by learned physicians. To the city, these endorsements were enough. If science sanctioned it, who could question it? Londoners did not see the small print, did not hear the quiet whispers of caution tucked between journal articles. They only saw results: children sleeping, wives calmer, husbands more at ease. And in the fog-bound streets, results were more persuasive than words. Dr. Atherton, too, reinforced the illusion. His confident hand administered the tonic, his polished voice offered reassurance, and his reputation lent weight to every measure. If a doctor of his standing declared something harmless, it must be so. The miraculous calm that spread through the Haraway's home seemed to confirm this truth. A mother's hands no longer trembled, a child's face no longer flushed with coughs, a father's shoulders no longer hunched beneath invisible burdens. All seemed restored, all seemed saved. And yet the miracle carried an unspoken cost. Its sweetness permeated the air, curling into the rooms of the house with a subtle persistence. The calm it promised was soft, seductive, and insidious. Each spoonful dissolved worries but also dulled appetites, softened thoughts, and slackened limbs. Families, unaware of the slow erosion, welcomed each measure with gratitude. They trusted what they could not fully understand because they had no other recourse. Even the servants, those first witnesses to the household's quiet decline, were lulled by the miracle's appearance. Lily, the housemaid, watched Charles drift gently into sleep and felt the edges of her unease soften. The nurse, vigilant though she remained, could not fully resist the allure of calm permeating the room. Everyone in the house, in some measure, became complicit in the enchantment, polite, orderly, and entirely trusting. In the streets outside, London itself seemed to echo the miracle. Fog-wrapped houses exhaled the faint, sweet scent of tonics and powders. Footsteps grew slower, voices softened, lamps flickered through the haze, casting a dreamlike glow over cobblestones. The city, for all its bustle, appeared unusually serene. Mothers, fathers, and children alike moved through their routines with a strange elegance, as though the miracle had whispered its spell beyond the confines of each home. And so the miracle endured. It was celebrated, praised, and, most dangerously, trusted. No one asked too closely what it cost. No one noticed the subtle toll hidden in its calm. The miracle was everywhere, soft, sweet, and entirely unquestioned. And the city, wrapped in fog and in faith, had no idea how precarious that trust truly was. Children in Victorian London were meant to be lively, curious, insistent on small pleasures, their appetites a simple measure of life's ordinary vigor. But under the influence of the tonic and powders, that measure began to falter. In the Haraway home, Charles's appetite, once modest but healthy, had begun to fade. It happened slowly at first, a teaspoon of broth left untouched, a bite of bread set aside, a refusal of tea that was half-hearted and fleeting. Yet, over days and weeks, the pattern grew unmistakable. The nurse noticed it first, as she always did. She prepared breakfast one grey morning, a small bowl of porridge, lightly sweetened, accompanied by slices of warm toast. Charles stirred it absent-mindedly, lifting the spoon to his lips with a motion too deliberate, too slow. He chewed mechanically, swallowing without taste. The nurse's heart tightened. "Darling," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, "you must eat. Strength comes from food." Charles looked up at her with a faint smile, pale lips barely moving. "I'm not very hungry," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed more than his words. Mrs. Haraway hovered nearby, her own weakness mirrored in his expression. She had begun to understand vaguely, unsettlingly, that the medicine meant to protect her son was also depriving him. She had once rejoiced at the peace it brought, the quiet that allowed her to watch him sleep without terror. Now, in the dim morning light, she saw a cost she had scarcely imagined. The powder behind her mirror, the cordial on the table, each had dulled him in ways invisible but insistent. Appetite, that simple measure of vitality, was the first casualty. And with it came subtle shifts. Energy lessened, skin paled, laughter softened, curiosity dimmed. He was still alive, still breathing, still moving. But he existed in a different rhythm, one dictated not by natural life, but by the chemical calm the household relied upon. Across London, the same quiet erosion occurred. Children in well-kept houses, in narrow alleys, in the grandest townhouses, were dosed in the evenings and mornings, their appetites becoming a suggestion rather than a necessity. Mothers reassured themselves that this was temporary, a minor trade for sleep, calm, and the avoidance of tantrums or coughs. Fathers, often fatigued by work and soot-streaked streets, trusted the household remedies, counting on them to preserve order. And children, obedient and trusting, complied without question. In the Haraway home, Lily, the housemaid, observed the slow diminishment with growing unease. She watched Charles push bread around his plate, nibble at nothing, sip his tea with a distracted hand. She watched Mrs. Haraway flinch each time the boy seemed listless, and she felt the lingering scent of the powders and tonics curling in the air, soft, sweet, and oppressive. "You should eat, Master Charles," she urged, her voice low, urgent, trembling, "or you will grow weaker." He nodded faintly, but the motion was hollow. His small body responded only half-heartedly to hunger, to need. The nurse sighed, catching the subtle rhythm of his shallow breaths, realizing that nourishment had become secondary to the chemical lull that dominated the household. Mr. Haraway, wrapped in the soothing effect of his own cordial, noticed little. The city had grown used to quiet meals and calm children, and so the family slipped further into habit, further into a slow, soft decline that no one yet dared name. Food, in the Haraway house, had become optional. Appetite, once a natural and insistent voice of life, had been replaced by sweetness. And with each day that passed, the child moved further into the fog, drifting between sustenance and stillness, between the familiar world and the chemical calm that threatened to claim him entirely. London watched in polite silence. The city's streets were thick with fog and anticipation, unaware that the smallest meals, the child's neglected porridge, the untouched bread, were the first visible signs of a tragedy far larger than any of them could yet comprehend, In every London home where the tonic or powder had entered, the mother was the first to learn its subtle power. She was the keeper of meals, the watcher of children, the manager of households, and, increasingly, the quiet enabler of the very thing that threatened to undo her family. For Mrs. Harroway, as for countless other housewives, the tonic had become more than a remedy. It had become a companion, a secret whisper in the still hours, a hand to hold when the city's fog and demands weighed too heavily on her nerves. It began innocently enough. A teaspoon in the morning, when the household stirred too early and the fog clung thickly to the window panes. A few grains of powder before the children awoke, to steady nerves frayed by endless work. A sip of cordial after lunch, to soften the tension in her chest that no one ever acknowledged. She justified every measure to herself. It was mild, it was safe, it was recommended. She was doing what mothers must do, ensuring calm and order. And yet, each dose carried with it a subtle erosion. Appetite dulled, limbs grew heavy, eyes softened in the way one might look at a child and see them through a veil of fog. Each dose made her hands more delicate, her steps more measured, her awareness of the world more dreamlike. The secret reliance began to ripple through her life like a quiet tide. She moved through the rooms with a measured grace that masked fatigue. The children, pale and soft-limbed from the same tonic that she administered, obeyed her silently. Charles slept more deeply each night, his breath steady yet unnervingly shallow. Mr. Harroway leaned on his cordial, trusting her judgment, unaware that she too had begun to sip in quiet desperation. Together, they floated through their home in a haze of sweet chemicals, unaware of how close they skirted the edge. The secrecy was essential. A housewife could not admit dependence, not in polite society. To do so would be to confess weakness, a breach of decorum that could ruin reputations. And so the measures were taken quietly, in the hush of the early morning or the fading light of evening, behind closed doors where no one could watch. She measured each teaspoon with the same care she gave to the household accounts, the same care she gave to her child's soup, the same care she gave to the ironing of collars. Precision, she believed, would prevent disaster. Yet the precision only delayed the inevitable. The nurse watched her carefully, noting the tremor in her fingers as she poured, the faint flush that crept across her cheeks after each sip. "Ma'am," she said gently one evening, "you must take care. You are growing so pale." Mrs. Harroway's laugh was soft, almost a whisper. "It is nothing," she said, "merely fatigue. The tonic helps. I assure you, I am fine." The nurse did not believe her. Lily, too, had begun to notice the subtle drift in her mistress's eyes, the way they lingered too long in the corners of rooms, the way she sometimes seemed to watch shadows move where none existed. The sweetness in the air clung to Mrs. Harroway now as if it were a second skin, inescapable, comforting, and deadly in its persistence. Across the city, housewives like her performed the same quiet rituals. Behind the mirrors, in the corners of pantries, in the polite hush of evening parlors, they administered teaspoon after teaspoon, convinced of their necessity. Each one reassured herself that she was doing right by her family, even as the subtle fog of chemical calm began to take its toll. Mrs. Harroway's secret reliance was no longer merely a convenience. It was a lifeline, a sedative, and a slow, invisible threat. And in a city of countless households, where mothers were the first and most constant guardians of their families, the pattern repeated endlessly. London was breathing softly, quietly, under the careful hands of women who believed themselves vigilant. And yet the city's pulse had begun to weaken. For the housewife who relied on the tonic, the powder, or the cordial, was not only protecting her family, she was becoming part of the very danger she sought to control. Children in Victorian London were meant to be lively, curious, insistent on small pleasures, their appetites a simple measure of life's ordinary vigor. But under the influence of the tonic and powders, that measure began to falter. In the Haraway home, Charles's appetite, once modest but healthy, had begun to fade. It happened slowly at first, a teaspoon of broth left untouched, a bite of bread set aside, a refusal of tea that was half-hearted and fleeting. Yet, over days and weeks, the pattern grew unmistakable. The nurse noticed it first, as she always did. She prepared breakfast one grey morning, a small bowl of porridge, lightly sweetened, accompanied by slices of warm toast. Charles stirred it absent-mindedly, lifting the spoon to his lips with a motion too deliberate, too slow. He chewed mechanically, swallowing without taste. The nurse's heart tightened. "Darling," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, "you must eat. Strength comes from food." Charles looked up at her with a faint smile, pale lips barely moving. "I'm not very hungry," he whispered, though his eyes betrayed more than his words. Mrs. Haraway hovered nearby, her own weakness mirrored in his expression. She had begun to understand vaguely, unsettlingly, that the medicine meant to protect her son was also depriving him. She had once rejoiced at the peace it brought, the quiet that allowed her to watch him sleep without terror. Now, in the dim morning light, she saw a cost she had scarcely imagined. The powder behind her mirror, the cordial on the table, each had dulled him in ways invisible but insistent. Appetite, that simple measure of vitality, was the first casualty. And with it came subtle shifts. Energy lessened, skin paled, laughter softened, curiosity dimmed. He was still alive, still breathing, still moving. But he existed in a different rhythm, one dictated not by natural life, but by the chemical calm the household relied upon. Across London, the same quiet erosion occurred. Children in well-kept houses, in narrow alleys, in the grandest townhouses, were dosed in the evenings and mornings, their appetites becoming a suggestion rather than a necessity. Mothers reassured themselves that this was temporary, a minor trade for sleep, calm, and the avoidance of tantrums or coughs. Fathers, often fatigued by work and soot-streaked streets, trusted the household remedies, counting on them to preserve order. And children, obedient and trusting, complied without question. In the Haraway home, Lily, the housemaid, observed the slow diminishment with growing unease. She watched Charles push bread around his plate, nibble at nothing, sip his tea with a distracted hand. She watched Mrs. Haraway flinch each time the boy seemed listless, and she felt the lingering scent of the powders and tonics curling in the air, soft, sweet, and oppressive. "You should eat, Master Charles," she urged, her voice low, urgent, trembling, "or you will grow weaker." He nodded faintly, but the motion was hollow. His small body responded only half-heartedly to hunger, to need. The nurse sighed, catching the subtle rhythm of his shallow breaths, realizing that nourishment had become secondary to the chemical lull that dominated the household. Mr. Haraway, wrapped in the soothing effect of his own cordial, noticed little. The city had grown used to quiet meals and calm children, and so the family slipped further into habit, further into a slow, soft decline that no one yet dared name. Food, in the Haraway house, had become optional. Appetite, once a natural and insistent voice of life, had been replaced by sweetness. And with each day that passed, the child moved further into the fog, drifting between sustenance and stillness, between the familiar world and the chemical calm that threatened to claim him entirely. London watched in polite silence. The city's streets were thick with fog and anticipation, unaware that the smallest meals, the child's neglected porridge, the untouched bread, were the first visible signs of a tragedy far larger than any of them could yet comprehend. In Victorian London, servants moved quietly through the city's grand houses, observing things that their masters could not, hearing what the family refused to acknowledge. They noticed how children lingered too long in bed, how mothers' hands trembled while arranging tea, how father's eyes softened with an unfamiliar dullness. They whispered among themselves, sharing fragments of observations, of unease, of fear. And in the Haraway household, it was Lily, the housemaid, who first gave voice to the suspicions that hung over the family like the city's dense, fog-bound air. It began in the early morning, when the household stirred barely enough to exist. Charles lay still in his bed, a faint pallor across his cheeks, his breaths measured and delicate. Mrs. Haraway sat quietly by the window, staring at the mist curling along the street, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Haraway had not yet risen, the faint sweetness of the cordial lingering on his breath from the night before. Lily moved through the hallways with her broom, listening to the quiet and counting the unusual stillness that pressed against the walls. She knew something was wrong. Later, while the nurse tended to Charles, Lily drew her aside, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp with the urgency of truth. "Mum," she said cautiously, glancing over her shoulder, "there's something in the house, something in the air. It's not just Charles, it's all of them." The nurse looked up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Lily's eyes darted toward the closed doors of the drawing room and the master bedroom. "I mean, the powder, the tonic. It's too much. They rely on it. Too often. Too freely. And I've seen it." She paused, swallowing. "Making them softer, slower, quieter. Even the mistress. She drifts like Charles. She doesn't notice it." The nurse's lips pressed together in a tight line. She had noticed the change herself, but the confirmation from Lily, whispered and urgent, sharpened her dread. The household's quiet descent was no longer a suspicion, it was a visible pattern, a secret epidemic hidden behind polite curtains and measured doses. Lily continued, lowering her voice further. "And the father," he lingers at the cordial, "drinks more than he ought. He thinks it calms him, but I've seen him dozing at his desk, missing appointments, forgetting things he would never forget before. The house itself, it feels heavy, too still, too soft." The nurse's hands trembled as she set down the basin she carried. The quiet in the room seemed suddenly oppressive, thick with unspoken danger. She realized what Lily had been saying was true. The household was slipping under the influence of chemical calm, and it was not just Charles who was at risk. The parents themselves were surrendering slowly, softly, to the same sweetness that promised comfort. "Do you think it's harming them?" the nurse asked cautiously. Lily shook her head. "I don't know if anyone can see it. Not the doctor, not the father, not even the mistress herself. But I see it. And soon, if no one intervenes, it will be too late." The words lingered in the room like the faint fragrance of the powders. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling along the rooftops and street lamps. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, listening to the whispers of those who noticed what others refused to see. The nurse grasped Lily's arm lightly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth she had spoken. Both women understood that in Victorian society, whispers were often the only tool available to those without power. And yet, whispers alone were insufficient to halt the invisible tide sweeping through homes like the Haraways. Lily moved silently to her duties, her heart heavy with dread. She would continue to observe, to whisper, to note every subtle change. The household slept under the spell of chemical calm, unaware that its own servant had begun to speak the truth no one else dared utter. London's fog thickened beyond the windows, and in the quiet, Lily's whispers carried farther than anyone imagined, though it would be years before the city heard them properly. Even the most confident physicians in London could not deny the strange patterns that had begun to ripple quietly through the city. Children who slept too deeply, mothers who seemed drained of appetite, fathers whose steps grew sluggish, these were not maladies easily explained by ordinary illness. Yet the response of the medical community was far from uniform. While some clung to faith in the tonics and powders that had become so ubiquitous, Others whispered uneasily in shadowed corners, their certainty beginning to fracture. The division among doctors became apparent at the Victorian Medical Society, a grand hall lined with oak and dimly lit by gas lamps. In one corner, Dr. Atherton presented his observations to colleagues he had long considered friends. He spoke of Charles Harroway, of the boy's near-tragic collapse after an evening dose, of the faintness that now clung to both parents. He described, as clinically as he could, the slow weakening of appetite, the pallor, the unnerving quiet that had taken residence in the household. Some physicians murmured their agreement. "Yes," one said cautiously. "I've seen similar cases in West London, children drifting into sleep with an almost chemical lethargy." Another nodded, adding, "And mothers, pale, drowsy. It is subtle, yet unmistakable." Yet across the room, others shook their heads, their expressions tight with disbelief. "Surely you exaggerate," one said, his voice smooth but sharp. "These remedies have been in use for years without incident. They are gentle, refined, the very essence of modern science. It is impossible that they could cause such catastrophic effects." The room divided itself subtly. Half the doctors leaned toward caution, speaking in hushed tones about dosage, individual sensitivity, and the emerging letters detailing similar observations. The other half defended the status quo, insisting on the tonic's safety, pointing to years of use and endorsements from respected colleagues. They cited chemical analyses, pharmaceutical records, and the city's faith in medical propriety as proof. The debate carried a polite veneer, yet tension thickened the air as thoroughly as the fog pressed against London's windows that winter. Dr. Atherton felt the weight of the room pressing upon him. He had always trusted in measurement, in observation, in science's ability to explain and predict. Yet here, among men he respected, he realized that evidence alone could not sway belief. Reputation, tradition, and the comforting faith of London's elite were formidable obstacles. "The patterns cannot be ignored," he insisted, his voice low but firm. "Even the faintest whisper of these effects must be acknowledged. Families are at risk. Children, mothers, fathers, they are all vulnerable. And yet, we continue to offer these substances as if they were mere refreshments." One senior physician, his hair powdered and his coat immaculate, leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Atherton, we cannot indulge in fear. Medicine is as much about public confidence as chemistry. To suggest harm where none has been proven is to endanger trust itself. London relies upon us." Another doctor, seated near the front, frowned. "But if even one child suffers unnecessarily, is not our duty greater than our comfort with tradition?" The room fell into murmured uncertainty. Papers rustled. Pens tapped desks. The candles flickered as though the gas itself were anxious. Outside, the fog deepened, curling around the society hall as though to listen. Even the city seemed to understand that something delicate and dangerous had taken root in homes from Bloomsbury to Clerkenwell. Dr. Atherton left the meeting that night with a sense of unease knotting his chest. Half the doctors would dismiss the warnings, half would ponder them with growing concern. And in the homes where the powders and tonics continued to slip silently into cups and spoons, families remained unaware that the very men entrusted to protect them were divided in belief. Somewhere in London, the Harroways' household exhaled another quiet sigh into the fog. The city held its breath, and the debate among doctors carried on, polite, invisible, and dangerously indecisive. For a divided profession could do nothing, and inaction in this city of sweetness and shadows was as lethal as the tonic itself. It was the coroner who first began to record the subtle horror with a precision that neither the newspapers nor the doctors dared. He did not write of scandal, nor of gossip, nor of public outrage. He wrote only of facts, observations, and patterns, the quiet truths that threaded themselves through the city's fog. His office, tucked above a modest row of law chambers near Whitechapel, smelled faintly of ink, drying paper, and the metallic tang of the instruments he preferred to keep polished and sharp. And it was here that the first uneasy notes were made. He had begun noticing a pattern months ago. Children brought in for what appeared to be ordinary illness, sometimes a mild cough, sometimes a fleeting fever, yet upon closer inspection, their condition differed from any traditional diagnosis. The young were pale beyond expectation, their breath shallow, their small hands limp in ways that made him pause. Mothers sometimes accompanied them, themselves fragile and wan, faces drained of color and expression. Fathers, too, occasionally arrived for inspection, their movements unusually lethargic. And always there was the faint, pervasive scent, sweet, chemical, lingering, almost imperceptible unless one leaned close. The coroner's handwriting reflected his unease. Small, precise letters, arranged in neat columns, notes of cases and timings, careful observations of color, pulse, respiration. Every entry began with the facts: name, age, residence, date of death, or, in fortunate cases, the date of the collapse that had nearly claimed life. Then came the notes of anomaly: excessive sleep, diminished appetite, unsteady pulse, unusual pallor, and sometimes a final line in the margin, almost as though written under duress, possibly connected to household substances, requires further investigation. He did not speak of the tonics openly, not yet. To suggest harm publicly would have been dangerous. Families trusted doctors, doctors trusted apothecaries, and the apothecaries trusted commerce. To question the chain was to risk reputation and livelihood alike, so he wrote quietly, meticulously, recording everything in case a pattern emerged, undeniable enough to demand attention. On a grey February morning, a particularly troubling case arrived. Young Thomas Blanchard, 4 years old, had been found slumped in his bed by a nurse in Westminster. His mother, distraught, insisted the boy had been restless and feverish, but the coroner's examination revealed no fever. The child's heartbeat was faint but regular, his color almost translucent. On the bedside table sat a small bottle of amber liquid, half empty. The sweet scent lingered in the air. It was a familiar aroma, one that had begun to invade his office through notes and reports. The coroner documented everything: the child's weight, the pallor, the faint chemical scent, the mother's frailty, the father's slowness. Each word felt heavier than the last. The pattern was unmistakable. Children, mothers, fathers, all showing the same subtle, terrifying signs. And always behind the scenes there was the same agent, the remedies sold, measured and trusted across London. He paused as he wrote the final line in the ledger. The substances meant to protect may, in fact, be exacting a slow toll. Patterns repeat, investigation urgent, though suppressed by fear and convention. The office was quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the distant toll of a church bell, muffled by the fog pressing against the window. Outside, London went about its morning. Gas lamps flickered against the grey mist, carriages rumbled faintly, and pedestrians hurried past unaware. Families prepared their breakfasts, children stirred from shallow slumber, and the sweet, chemical haze settled into curtains, bedding, and small, polite hands. No one outside his office knew. No one would know unless the coroner's notes were read. Yet he understood that each line he wrote was a warning, a record of danger too subtle for most to acknowledge, too quiet to provoke immediate outrage. The city continued to trust. The powders continued to circulate. The tonics were poured into cups and teaspoons. And in the quiet, unseen corners of London, the coroner's uneasy notes grew heavier with each case. For the deaths were few, measured, discreet, polite tragedies in polite homes. And the city, wrapped in fog and sweetness, remained oblivious to the quiet, creeping calamity. London had long been familiar with sickness. The city's fog brought with it colds, chills, and coughs. The crowded streets invited contagion. The Thames whispered of cholera and typhus that had stalked the populace in years past. Yet the new malady was unlike anything the city had known. It did not arrive with the feverish heat of influenza, nor the violent purges of consumption. It came softly, subtly, unnoticed at first, and in that quiet it was far more insidious. Families fell into weakness without the outward signs of disease. The body remained intact, only vitality ebbed away. In the Haraway home, the change had become undeniable. Charles, once a lively boy of 8, now moved through his days with the soft fatigue of a child who had spent a lifetime asleep. His eyes no longer sparkled with curiosity. His laughter was muted, polite rather than joyous. He obeyed instructions with a mechanical precision that spoke of too much sedation, too much calm imposed by the amber tonics that glimmered on the mantelpiece. The nurse watched him vigilantly, counting each breath as though the act of observation could restore what the medicines had stolen. Mrs. Haraway, too, had begun to fade. Her appetite, once modest but healthy, dwindled almost imperceptibly at first, then more clearly. Meals were nibbled absent-mindedly, and even the ritual of pouring tea became a labor, her hands unsteady and her mind distant. She drifted through rooms like a shadow of herself, her thoughts soft, her awareness dulled. The powder behind her mirror had become a quiet companion, offering calm while exacting its toll. She was not ill in the traditional sense, yet London would soon learn that a home can be poisoned without fire or fever. Mr. Haraway fared no better. He leaned heavily on the cordial, the amber liquid carrying him through evenings as though it were a rope across an invisible chasm. His mind, once sharp with the precision of accounts and business calculations, softened. Details he would have recalled instantly began to slip through his memory. Letters went unanswered. Ledgers were misread. Appointments were missed. And yet, when questioned, he insisted he felt well, merely fatigued by the winter fog and the long hours of the counting house. Across London, similar patterns emerged. A clerk in Whitechapel found his children unusually quiet, too compliant, almost dreamlike after doses of powders meant to calm nerves. In Bloomsbury, a mother rose from her bed hours late, limbs weak, eyes clouded, yet insisted she was merely tired. In Lambeth, a household doctor noted that patients seemed unusually subdued, and yet no official illness could be named. The city's doctors were divided. Apothecaries reassured. Newspapers published cautious reports that lacked detail. The subtlety of the ailment ensured that suspicion grew slowly, quietly, while the effects multiplied. Even the fog itself seemed complicit, curling through streets, drifting into homes, carrying the faint sweetness of tonics and powders into every corner. It blurred sound and light alike, masking the hush that fell over families, the gentle surrender to sedation, the pallor and quiet desperation no one dared speak of. Londoners, accustomed to disease marked by heat, convulsions, or visible collapse, could not recognize the threat that came clothed in calm, gentleness, and trust. In the Haraway house, the nurse and Lily whispered in corners, their voices tight with urgency. They saw the drift, the subtle softening, the quiet resignation, but the city at large remained oblivious. Streets bustled, markets filled, children laughed in parks, yet even here, behind closed doors, the illness was spreading silently, unannounced, unmeasured, and unrecognized. It was not an illness that fevered the body. It was a quiet thief, stealing vigor, appetite, attention, and independence. It was a malady that went unnoticed precisely because it made no outward display of suffering. And so London remained blind to the city's ill that was not illness, a hidden epidemic, carried in teaspoons, dripped from decanters, inhaled from powders, and woven into the fabric of polite life. It advanced softly, insidiously, and in the quiet, families began to lose themselves without understanding how or why. The city's heartbeat slowed. Its streets, its homes, and its people moved more softly, and the danger, invisible to all but the few, pressed steadily onward. It took a newspaper to awaken London from its quiet trance, not with sirens or cries, not with outrage or scandal, but with words printed in ink and pressed into paper, a medium the city trusted more than the whisper of servants, the caution of nurses, or even the judgment of its own physicians. One February morning, as fog curled over the Thames and pressed against the gas lamps along cobblestone streets, the London Gazette delivered a small but extraordinary revelation, a report that named the tonic, the powders and the cordials that had pervaded homes with sweet, chemical calm. It was subtle, precise, and terrifying. The headline was modest, almost polite, but its impact cut sharply through polite society. Household remedies under scrutiny. Reports of excessive sleep and faintness among families. In the Haraway home, Lily, the housemaid, found the paper discarded on the doorstep. Her heart thumped in a rhythm she did not trust. The nurse had already seen the same edition. Together, they read each paragraph in silence, noting every word that hinted at the truth they had been too afraid to articulate. Children sedated by the very remedies meant to protect them, mothers' health subtly undermined, fathers lulled into lethargy by nightly cordial, families drifting into quiet, unnatural sleep. Mrs. Haraway, seated by the window, took the paper into her hands with trembling fingers. Her eyes traced the lines, a slow horror dawning upon her. She could see herself reflected in every report, her soft steps, her fading appetite, the tremor in her hands as she administered the powder to Charles. She could see her husband, slouched in his chair, face softened by the cordial, his mind dulled in ways she had once found comforting. And, most painfully, she saw Charles, pale, quiet, obedient beyond vitality, drifting further into the fog with each measured teaspoon. The nurse and Lily exchanged a glance heavy with understanding. At last, the evidence of what they had long feared was undeniable. No longer whispers in corners, no longer subtle signs noticed only by the vigilant. The city itself had spoken. The paper had broken the spell. Beyond the Haraway household, similar scenes unfolded. Across Bloomsbury, Clerkenwell, and Lambeth, families read the report in shock. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, counting breaths with new attention. Fathers who had sipped nightly cordials now paused, eyes narrowing in realization. Even the apothecaries read with unease, fingers hovering over bottles, the polished labels suddenly unfamiliar, the promises they had repeated so often now suspiciously hollow. The physicians were divided no longer. The doctors who had clung to tradition and reassurance found their authority undermined by the tangible, printed record. The cautious men who had whispered their doubts in private felt vindicated, though the vindication was bitter. The knowledge that harm had been quietly permitted, accepted, and perpetuated. In the Haraway home, the effect was immediate and profound. Charles, awakened from a shallow, chemically induced slumber, blinked with more vivid clarity than he had shown in weeks. Mrs. Haraway set aside the powder, her hands trembling, and rose with a determination she had almost forgotten. Mr. Haraway, startled by the news, pushed away his glass of cordial and looked at the amber liquid with suspicion for the first time. The house itself seemed to exhale, the oppressive quiet lifting in small, subtle waves. Outside, London stirred. Servants whispered to one another as they carried the news from house to house. The fog, that ever-present veil, seemed to thin, letting in light that had been long obscured. The city had been reminded, through the careful, authoritative reporting of the newspaper, that not all calm was benign, not all sweetness harmless. The paper did not end the epidemic. Families had already absorbed too much. The toll of subtle sedation, diminished appetite, and quiet lethargy could not be undone in a single day. But it offered recognition, a first glimmer of truth. The spell that had dulled minds and softened limbs was broken, at least in consciousness, if not yet in effect. London, for the first time in months, awoke. The fog pressed against the windows, softened but persistent, as if the city itself were still remembering the sweetness it had inhaled. Families adjusted, cautiously, eyes sharpened, hands trembled less, thought more. And the newspaper, modest in size but immense in impact, had done what the whispers, the nurses' warnings, and the coroner's notes could not. It had made the invisible visible. The spell was broken. And the city, trembling but alert, began the long, uncertain process of reclaiming itself. The news had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated, riding on the ink of newspapers, the gossip of servants, and the anxious whispers of mothers. By the third day after the London Gazette report, parlours across Bloomsbury, Mayfair, and Clerkenwell were alive with a nervous energy that had no precedent. It was not an uproar of shouting or outrage, but a quieter, sharper tremor, a panic that twined itself delicately through teacups, embroidery frames, and silver spoons. London society had been reminded that the miracles it trusted were not miracles at all. In the Harroway home, the panic began with Mrs. Harroway. She had risen early, setting aside the powder she had so carefully dosed over weeks, and paced the drawing room with hands clasped, murmuring to herself in a voice trembling with fear. Charles's bedroom door remained ajar, the child watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. Mr. Harroway, still groggy from an interrupted morning nap, stirred uneasily, sensing the tension but unable to pinpoint its origin. A knock at the door startled them all. Lily, the housemaid, announced the arrival of the nurse's cousin, a fellow caregiver from Westminster, who carried a newspaper and a letter from a worried mother. The courier's expression mirrored their own unease. Her presence, her papers, her hurried explanations only amplified the sense of alarm. "It is happening everywhere," she whispered. "Families, children, mothers, fathers, all affected. And the tonics, the powders, the cordials, they are the common thread." Mrs. Harroway's hands trembled as she took the papers. Her eyes flicked between headlines and paragraphs, scanning the accounts of children found sleeping through the morning, mothers discovered fainted in their chairs, fathers found slouched over desks in slow stupor. Each word was a reflection of their own household, each line a mirror of the subtle decay she had been too afraid to name. The panic spread outward, invisible yet contagious. In parlours across the city, similar scenes unfolded. Women clutched their teacups more tightly, staring at one another with eyes wide and pale. Gentlemen, previously dismissive of household anxieties, exchanged hurried whispers behind screens of polite decorum. Servants scurried between kitchens and stairways, carrying messages, warning each other of doses, reminding themselves that the subtle quiet in the drawing room could no longer be ignored. Even the apothecaries felt the tremor. Customers arrived with fingers twitching, eyes darting nervously around polished counters. "Is it safe?" one mother demanded, her voice unusually sharp for a polite question. "Are the tonics truly harmless?" Apothecaries offered measured reassurances, but uncertainty had taken hold, and even the smoothest assurances rang hollow in the tense air. In the Harroway household, the panic coalesced in a way both immediate and terrifying. Mrs. Harroway ordered Charles to be fed, though he had refused for days. She poured him water, tea, broth, and insisted he take every sip. Mr. Harroway, still groggy, attempted to follow her instructions, but his body betrayed him, heavy and slow from the lingering effects of his nightly cordial. Lily and the nurse exchanged glances across the room, recognizing the extraordinary tension, knowing that if the family did not act decisively, the slow, chemical calm that had softened the household could claim them entirely. By noon, the parlor had transformed. Cups were overturned in haste. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. The faint chemical sweetness that had once lulled the household into a dangerous serenity was now oppressive, almost acrid in its scent. The city outside, fog-bound and silent, seemed to press in upon the house, mirroring the sudden collective dread that had taken hold within. The panic in the parlors was not mere hysteria. It was recognition, the first tangible acknowledgement that the subtle, creeping hazard which had lulled London into complacency was real, immediate, and perilous. Families, servants, and even those who had once trusted the miracle of tonics and powders understood at last that the quiet, sweet haze in their homes was not comfort, but a slow, invisible siege. And in the Haraway house, as mother, father, and child moved anxiously under the watchful eyes of nurse and maid, the panic had only begun to unfold. The city's realization, soft and fragile as it was, had set in motion a reckoning whose scope would soon extend far beyond a single home. Even as the parlors shivered with whispered panic, the medical establishment clung stubbornly to the comfort of certainty. In the grand offices and lecture halls of London, doctors gathered behind polished oak desks, in rooms fragrant with ink and faintly antiseptic air, and denied what the city had begun to suspect. They denied it with the precision of habit, the authority of years, and the unwavering confidence of men accustomed to being obeyed. To admit that the tonics, powders, and cordials, those trusted companions of households from Bloomsbury to Clerkenwell, might carry hidden peril, would be to unravel the very fabric of their profession. Dr. Atherton, still uneasy after witnessing Charles Haraway's near collapse, found himself in the minority. He had recorded every observation, every tremor, every paleness with clinical care. Yet when he raised his concerns among his peers, he was met with a wall of polite disbelief. "Preposterous," said one, adjusting the cuff of his coat with meticulous care. "You suggest that substances so widely administered, so universally endorsed, could produce harm in such a subtle manner. Absurd. The tonics are perfectly safe. I have prescribed them for years without incident." Another nodded solemnly, tapping his quill against the polished mahogany of the lectern. "Gentlemen, you speak as though the city's trust can be dismissed lightly. These remedies have been used in hundreds of households. No physician of standing has documented harm. To cast suspicion now is to destabilize the delicate confidence upon which public health depends." A third leaned forward, voice measured but cold. "We cannot allow anecdotal observation to dictate medical practice. One family's experience does not indict the entire city. Reports of faintness, drowsiness, or diminished appetite are most likely the product of natural variation, fatigue, or unrelated illness." Dr. Atherton opened his mouth to argue, to present his meticulously kept notes, the letters from apothecaries, the whisperings of servants, the subtle yet undeniable decline of Charles and his parents. But every word seemed to fall into a void. The others nodded, exchanged glances, and returned to the safety of routine and precedent. His evidence, though detailed and precise, was dismissed as exception, anomaly, or the exaggeration of anxious minds. Meanwhile, London continued to stir uneasily. Mothers read the morning papers and whispered to one another. Servants carried news from house to house. Children, obedient yet faint, moved quietly through homes filled with chemical calm. And yet, in the lecture halls and offices where the city's authority on health resided, denial prevailed. Dr. Atherton felt the weight of their confidence pressing down upon him, heavier than any chemical haze. He knew the truth, subtle, creeping, and dangerous, and yet he was alone in recognizing it. The very men whose judgments the city trusted were blind to the slow, insidious effects of the remedies they had embraced without scrutiny. He returned to his office that evening, gas lamps flickering against the fog-bound streets outside, and stared at his ledger. Each line he had written now seemed heavier, each observation more urgent. Families were drifting into quiet lethargy, their bodies softened, their appetites diminished, their minds dulled. And yet, the city's physicians, pillars of authority and public trust, had denied it all. They had sealed the doors of perception, insisting that nothing was amiss, that everything remained proper, safe, and above reproach. The city outside exhaled under the fog, oblivious, trusting, and dangerously compliant. Households slept under the spell of the tonics and powders, unaware that those meant to guard them had turned their eyes elsewhere, denying the threat, preserving tradition, and unwittingly abetting the quiet erosion of life. In every polished office, in every lecture hall, in every carefully measured prescription, denial reigned supreme. And in London, wrapped in sweet fog and unquestioning trust, the subtle danger moved unchallenged, a quiet calamity, acknowledged by none and understood by only a few. It is a peculiar weight that rests upon the shoulders of mothers in Victorian London. Even when nothing is their fault, the city's expectations, the whispers of society, and the steady hum of domestic responsibility convince them otherwise. And so, when the first hint of danger in the tonics and powders reached the parlours, it was the mothers who first carried the burden, who first accused themselves for the subtle decay creeping into their households. Mrs. Harroway, like countless others, found herself awake long before dawn, staring out at fog-drenched streets, hands pressed to the marble mantel. The amber glow of the remaining tonic on the table cast shadows across her pale face. She thought of Charles, curled beneath his blankets, and of herself, the countless teaspoons administered, the tiny pinches of powder, the doses given in the secrecy of early mornings and late evenings. Every action, once comforting, now felt like a betrayal. Had she lulled her child into this unnatural stillness? Had she dimmed her husband's vigor as she had her own? She carried the question with her through the day. She set the breakfast table, her hands shaking despite the care she took. She measured the porridge and tea with excessive precision, almost as if she could balance guilt and nourishment in equal proportion. But each movement reminded her that she, in her desire to protect, had instead contributed to the quiet weakening of her family. Other mothers were not spared the same internal verdict. Across Bloomsbury, in Mayfair, in narrow alleys where fog clung to soot-streaked bricks, mothers whispered to one another behind lace curtains, in hushed voices, pale and trembling. "It is my fault," one would murmur. "I gave too much, or too often," said another. Eyes, once bright with pride in carefully tended children, now shone with anxious blame. No one outside the home understood this internalized terror, a silent accusation as persistent as the chemical sweetness lingering in the air. Even when newspapers printed the first cautious reports, the mothers absorbed them as personal condemnation. Headlines suggested only a vague connection between remedies and the subtle lethargy of children or adults, yet each mother read the subtext as judgment. Your hand may have faltered. Your care may have been too generous. In parlours and kitchens, the phrase measured dosage became a mantra and a curse, each teaspoon a potential crime, each pinch a potential tragedy. In the Harroway home, the nurse watched Mrs. Harroway with growing concern. The mother hovered over Charles, her movements meticulous yet frantic, checking his blanket, his breathing, the faint flutter of eyelids. Every small sigh or cough was scrutinized, as though she could prevent the inevitable by the sheer force of attention. Yet, in her vigilance, she blamed herself. She had offered the powder behind the mirror, measured the tonic for her husband, and allowed the calm to settle like a fog over their lives. Now that calm seemed a weapon she had wielded unknowingly. The quiet, pervasive guilt settled on families like dust in the corners of well-kept rooms. It clung to mothers' clothing, whispered through hallways, and infected the air with an unspoken heaviness. Children, too young to understand the complexity of adult fear, sensed it, their obedience heightened, their laughter subdued, their appetite softened. Fathers, though oblivious to much, felt it indirectly in the subdued movements of wives and children, the quiet hush that had replaced the household's former energy. In parlours across London, society's expectations compounded the burden. Mothers could not speak openly of the danger, nor could they question the authority of apothecaries or physicians. Their blame, therefore, remained private, internal, unshared, except in whispers to other mothers who bore the same weight. It was a collective suffering rendered intimate, silent, and deeply corrosive. Mrs. Harroway pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady the thrum of fear and guilt. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, curling its cold fingers into the corners of the room. The sweetness of the tonics hung faintly in the air, a ghostly echo of the comfort she had once sought. And in that quiet, she understood the harm was not just in the powder or cordial, nor only in the tonic. It was in the trust, in the faith, in the care she had offered so diligently. She had tried to protect, she had tried to nurture, and now, in the hush of the morning, she blamed herself entirely. The mothers of London, silent and vigilant, carried the heaviest toll, the invisible weight of guilt that no newspaper, no doctor, and no apothecary could ever measure. In Victorian London, death was a ritual of observation as much as of mourning. The coroner's office, tucked away from the bustle of fog-laden streets, smelled of cold stone, ink, and the faint metallic trace of steel instruments. Here, where the final truths of life and the subtle patterns of mortality were recorded with meticulous precision, a new and troubling phenomenon had begun to emerge. The deaths of children, mothers, and even fathers, under the quiet influence of household tonics and powders, required examination, but what the autopsies revealed was unlike the illness London had known before. Bodies were laid upon tables as if for an ordinary examination, yet the signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. There was no fever to blaze the skin, no convulsions to betray the mind, no racking coughs or bruised lungs to signal catastrophe. Instead, the telltale marks were found in pallor, in frailty, in the faint softness of limbs that once held strength. A child's fingers, delicate as porcelain, lacked the resistance they ought to have. A mother's cheek, once warm, carried a translucent chill. A father's chest rose with shallow, measured breaths, as if the life within were weighted by invisible hands. The coroner's notes, already meticulous, grew increasingly uneasy. He recorded every detail: age, sex, home address, occupation, diet, recent illnesses, and always a faint chemical residue, almost imperceptible, clinging to hair, nails, and clothing. The tonics, powders, and cordials were there, present in the residue, subtle yet undeniable. His pen paused over each line, the careful script trembling slightly in acknowledgement of a truth London was slow to face. These deaths were not accidents, not conventional illnesses. They were the quiet consequences of substances considered harmless, administered in faith, trusted for generations. The autopsies were silent in more than name. Families were rarely informed of the full details. The city's papers reported only generalized findings, offering no hint of chemical subtlety. Doctors wrote vague conclusions, often attributing death to natural causes, weak constitution, or faint susceptibility. Yet the coroner's private ledger contained everything: the faint traces of powder, the diminished appetite noted by servants, the extreme sleepiness recorded in household diaries, the very sweetness in the air that had lulled London into a gentle oblivion. Each case read like the last, Families broken not by disease, but by a quiet, persistent chemical lull. Children who had obeyed with eerie compliance. Mothers whose care had inadvertently imposed soft sedation. Fathers who, seeking reprieve from work and worry, had sipped cordials into a slow stupor. London's domestic life, once vigorous and orderly, now carried an undercurrent of lethargy so uniform it could only be measured in faint notes and careful observation. The coroner often found himself alone late into the evening, pondering the magnitude of his discoveries. The city continued its business, streets bustling, markets open, fog curling in familiar patterns. But in quiet homes, the subtle effects of the tonics lingered. Mothers, fathers, children, all moving softly, lightly, their vitality diminished under the guise of calm. He feared, though he did not say it aloud, that the silent autopsies were only the beginning. Each body laid out, examined, and recorded was a testament to a quiet calamity that had been building for months, an epidemic of calm, an invisible thief of vigor, an understated erosion of life that the city had failed to recognize until the dead spoke in their absence. And so he recorded diligently, his pen scratching across paper with the precision of a man confronting something both scientific and profoundly moral. Each line, each note, each subtle observation was a quiet warning, one the city could choose to heed or continue to ignore at its peril. London, still enveloped in fog and the faint scent of tonics, remained unaware. But the coroner knew. Death had left no noise, no scream, only a hush that would speak volumes to those who dared to listen. The streets of London had long carried the scents of the city: coal smoke, wet cobblestones, the tang of the Thames, and the faint perfume of shop fronts. But in that winter of quiet calamity, another fragrance threaded itself through the fog, the subtle, insidious sweetness of tonics and powders, drifting from parlours and kitchens, curling beneath doors and along stairwells. It was a fragrance that hinted at comfort, at calm, at domestic order, but beneath it lingered something darker: regret. For those who walked the streets, the air seemed heavier than usual. Fog pressed against coats and collars, softening footsteps and muffling voices. Carriages moved more slowly, horses stamping with hesitation on the slick cobblestones. And everywhere, the faint chemical scent coiled through the mist, marking the invisible path of a quiet, creeping harm. Londoners, accustomed to the smells of the city, noticed a difference, though they could not name it. Mothers clutched children a little tighter. Fathers hurried with furrowed brows. Shopkeepers sniffed the air and frowned. Something was in the fog, yet no one could trace it to its source. In the Harroway neighborhood, the effect was palpable. Windows were drawn, curtains heavy, doors tightly closed against the chill and against the scent that crept through the cracks. Inside homes, families moved with muted steps, speaking in softened tones. Children's laughter was restrained. Adults' conversation carried a faint edge of tension, a recognition that the city's vitality was fading in ways invisible but undeniable. The tonics, powders, and cordials that were meant to preserve calm had instead delivered a different gift: lethargy, pallor, and unease. Servants whispered of it, passing through streets while running errands or delivering letters. "The air smells different," Lily, the Harroway housemaid, said to a friend while delivering coal. "Sweet, too sweet, and heavy. You can taste it in the mouth, and yet it is nothing you touch." Her friend shivered, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Aye," she said. "I've smelled it in 3 houses already. Something is wrong." The coroner's notes, the newspaper articles, the quiet panic in parlours, all had begun to converge in these streets. Londoners could not ignore it any longer. The scent carried not only the chemicals, but the awareness of consequence. Each inhalation was a reminder of children who had slept too long, mothers who had grown frail, fathers softened beyond recognition. It was the aroma of trust betrayed, of domestic vigilance undermined, of the city's faith in its own order beginning to fracture. Even the vendors on the fog-drenched streets sensed it. Milkmen and bakers, usually indifferent to subtle scents, noted the unusual sweetness lingering in the air and recoiled slightly, hastening their rounds. Their horses stamped nervously. The fog seemed to hang heavier on their shoulders, and yet the city moved as if unaware, each household continuing its reliance on the very remedies that had begun to dim its life. Inside the Haraway house, Mrs. Haraway paused at the window, inhaling the fog. The sweetness clung to the glass and to her hands, reminding her of the powders she had administered, the cordials she had measured, the teaspoons she had offered so diligently. Her heart clenched with quiet regret. She had sought only to calm, to soothe, to protect, and yet the effect had been precisely the opposite. Her family's vitality, once a measure of health and joy, had been quietly diminished under her careful stewardship. Mr. Haraway leaned against the doorframe, pale and sluggish, oblivious to the significance of the scent. Charles lay in his bed, restless yet subdued, breathing softly, a victim of the subtle haze that had settled over the household. And outside, the streets pressed the same sweetness into every crack, every doorway, every unnoticed corner. London had inhaled it, and in its breath, the city carried not only the scent of chemicals, but the weight of regret. Families lulled into compliance, health softened beneath trust, and the quiet understanding that the very comforts they had embraced might have betrayed them entirely. The fog wrapped the streets, the houses, and the city in a palpable hush, thick with sweetness and sorrow. And London, moving slowly beneath it, had begun to feel the first stirrings of recognition. That comfort, when trusted blindly, could carry a far heavier toll than any illness. It took a courtroom to make the invisible tangible, to summon London's attention from parlours, fog-bound streets, and whispered corridors. In a chamber lined with polished oak and shadowed by high, narrow windows, the first formal accusations began to pierce the city's cultivated veneer. The tonics, powders, and cordials, once celebrated for their gentle efficacy, were brought into question before the law, and with them the reputations of doctors, apothecaries, and even well-intentioned housewives began to crumble. The trial opened quietly, though the city outside buzzed with unease. Families, servants, and curious onlookers pressed into the wooden benches, their coats damp with fog, eyes wide with anticipation. On the raised dais, the judge presided with a calm severity, his powdered wig and solemn robes offering the only certainty in a room otherwise steeped in tension. Lawyers, practiced and precise, presented their cases with clipped, courteous language, each word chosen to appear factual, yet damning. Dr. Atherton, summoned reluctantly, stood at the witness table, his shoulders slumped slightly, not from age but from the weight of knowledge he had carried in silence. He recounted his observations of Charles Haraway, the faint chemical residue, the altered behaviors of both parents, and the gradual, imperceptible decline he had documented. Every word was measured, but each one carried the tremor of conscience, the knowledge that inaction had allowed harm to propagate silently. Across the room, the Apothecaries' counsel defended their clients with a polished ferocity. Bottles had been sold as advertised, labels were accurate, and any adverse effects were isolated or anecdotal. They cited endorsements, testimonials, and the trust of physicians to assert that the remedies had been both safe and necessary. Yet in the haze of the courtroom, each argument felt thinner than the perfume-laden air, each defense fraying beneath the weight of patient testimonies and private notes brought to light. The first witnesses were the servants. Lily, the Haraway housemaid, described the subtle shifts she had observed, the child's unnatural compliance, the mistress's trembling hands, the master's sluggish movements. She spoke of whispered fears, of teaspoons measured carefully, of powders administered behind closed doors. Her testimony, given with a quiet gravity, carried the stark clarity of someone who had watched the household's slow decline from a position both powerless and intimately aware. Mothers from nearby streets followed, recounting children who slept beyond reason, husbands lulled into lethargy, the creeping calm that dulled families' awareness. Each story was measured, polite, yet heavy with accusation. The courtroom, for all its decorum, became thick with the weight of undeniable pattern. A city lulled into trust and betrayed by the very substances it believed harmless. Observers whispered among themselves. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, carrying the faint chemical sweetness from nearby parlours into the solemn chamber. Londoners, long accustomed to polite appearances and invisible dangers, now heard them rendered audible, undeniable, and horrifyingly real. The judge, silent until now, lifted his gaze. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the trembling mothers, the careful housemaids, the sombre faces of doctors forced to acknowledge what they had long denied. His voice, calm yet resonant, reminded all present of the stakes: a family's health, a city's trust, and the fragile integrity of a profession revered above all else. Outside, the fog pressed harder. Inside, whispers fell silent as the weight of judgment settled over the chamber. London had finally begun to confront the reality it had ignored for so long. The tonics, powders, and cordials were not harmless. Beneath the veneer of calm, the city had suffered, and the reputations of those once trusted most had begun to crumble before public scrutiny. And in that courtroom, with the echo of gas lamps flickering against oak, London recognized a truth long obscured. Trust misplaced is a quiet poison, and when it is dispensed to an entire city, even silence carries consequences. In London, the law moved with the deliberate pace of a carriage navigating fogged streets, methodical, formal, and often oblivious to the urgency pressing at its heels. By the time the first hearings had begun, the quiet devastation wrought by tonics, powders, and cordials had already claimed its victims. Families weakened, children subdued, mothers drained, fathers dulled. The city was alive with the consequences of inaction long before the courts were convened. And in the grand chambers where justice was meant to be dispensed, the law struggled to catch up to the subtleties of a new and invisible peril. The Haraway household, like countless others, had already borne the brunt. Charles, pale and fragile, moved with an effort that betrayed weeks of chemical sedation. Mrs. Haraway's hands shook as she prepared meals, her appetite gone, her awareness dulled. Mr. Haraway leaned too heavily on his cordials, his mind softening with every sip. Outside, the fog pressed insistently against windows, curling into hallways, staircases, and rooms where trust had been betrayed gently, invisibly, and with devastating effect. The courtroom was austere, its walls lined with polished oak, its benches filled with families, servants, and observers, each carrying their own unease. The proceedings were careful, the language meticulous, each word weighed as though it could alter fate itself. But the law had been slow. The first deaths, the faintest signs of chemical harm, had occurred months prior. Evidence had been collected in diaries, coroner's notes, nurse reports, and whispered testimonies. By the time judges and juries convened, the damage was already done. Witnesses took the stand, recounting events that had unfolded behind closed doors. Teaspoons measured with care, powders hidden behind mirrors, cordials administered with polite assurances. Mothers described children found unusually lethargic, their appetites diminished, their laughter muted. Fathers described nights of deep, unnatural sleep, mornings clouded by fatigue and forgetfulness. Servants spoke softly of subtle patterns, noticing the faint chemical scent lingering in rooms, hallways, and stairwells. Each account layered upon the last, painting a city-wide portrait of decline, of trust betrayed, of caution ignored. The law listened, measured, and recorded. Judges nodded gravely, scribes copied every detail with deliberate care. And yet, the formalities of procedure slowed the recognition of consequence. Depositions were read, cross-examinations carried out, objections sustained and overruled. Every action respected protocol, every question measured in tone and volume. But the subtle, insidious erosion of life did not wait for proper phrasing or official notice. Children continued to drift in hazy sleep. Mothers continued to fade quietly. Fathers continued to linger at cordials, and the fog outside pressed its sweet scent into every corner of London. By the time verdicts were announced, families had already absorbed the consequences. Some households had lost children, some had seen parents diminished in vigor, in appetite, in presence. The law could not return what had been consumed quietly, invisibly. The measures were preventive only in theory, reactive only when recognition came too late. Polite apologies, financial reparations, formal reprimands, these could not restore what trust and vitality had been quietly drained over months of chemical calm. In the Haraway home, the nurse and Lily looked on with a solemn understanding. They had warned, observed, recorded. They had carried knowledge in whispered voices and furtive glances. And yet, even now, the law moved too slowly to prevent the quiet toll exacted by tonics and powders, administered in faith, accepted in trust, and consumed in gentle ignorance. London had waited too long. The city had relied upon authority, propriety, and trust, and those pillars had failed to prevent harm. And in the solemn halls of justice, the truth was rendered in measured phrases, too late to save those who had already paid the price. The law, bound by procedure and formality, could record the tragedy. It could warn the living. It could discipline the negligent. But it could not restore what had been quietly, irresistibly lost in homes across a fog-bound city. And in that realization, the true weight of consequence settled over London like the lingering chemical sweetness in its streets, silent, pervasive, and irrevocable. In the quiet hours of a dim February evening, the discovery was made. It was not heralded by alarm bells, nor by the frantic cries of neighbors. It came with the soft click of a drawer being opened, and the faint amber glow of a small glass bottle resting within, long forgotten yet still potent. The bottle was the final remnant of the tonics and powders that had seeped imperceptibly into the lives of the Haraway household and countless others across London. Its presence was innocuous in appearance, but the air around it carried the weight of months of trust, of reliance, and of the slow erosion of vitality that had already taken its toll. Mrs. Haraway, pacing the drawing-room with restless hands, had been searching for something, a letter, a misplaced key, an explanation she could not articulate. Her fingers brushed the drawer, and it yielded a small resistance before swinging open. There it was, a delicate bottle, cork still intact, the liquid inside, faintly luminous under the flickering light of the lamp. A sweetness rose from it immediately, curling into the room like the ghost of every teaspoon and every pinch that had been measured with maternal care. She lifted it cautiously, as if it were fragile, as if it might shatter the quiet around her simply by existing. The nurse, observing from the doorway, recognized the scent instantly. Familiar, chemical, deceptively soft. Lily, standing beside her, had the same reaction. All three understood at once the significance of the bottle. This was not merely medicine. This was the final witness, a last tangible piece of the slow, invisible decay that had taken root in the household. The nurse reached out and took the bottle from Mrs. Haraway's trembling hands. She examined it carefully, her fingers pressing lightly against the cool glass. "So much has come from this," she whispered, voice low, as though afraid the very walls might overhear. "So much, and now we see the last of it." Mrs. Harroway sank into a chair, fingers pressed to her lips, eyes wide. She recalled each measure she had administered, each night she had quietly dispensed the powder to Charles, each small sip of cordial she had offered her husband. The bottle in her hands, seemingly inert, embodied all the quiet guilt she had carried, all the trust she had placed in remedies she believed harmless, and all the subtle, insidious damage that had accrued unnoticed. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, thick and persistent, carrying with it the faint chemical sweetness that had infiltrated every corner of the city. London seemed to exhale slowly, as if aware of the final bottle's discovery, as though the air itself acknowledged the danger it had facilitated. The scent in the room clung to the curtains, to the floorboards, to the lingering warmth of the evening. It was impossible to ignore. It was impossible not to understand what had been lost, what had been dulled, and what had been stolen under the guise of domestic calm. In parlours across the city, similar bottles were found. Mothers, wives, and housemaids opened drawers, cupboards, and mirrors, discovering the remnants of months' reliance on substances that had promised safety but delivered something far more subtle and dangerous. The tonics were no longer miraculous, powders no longer gentle. They were relics of complacency, proof of a trust placed blindly, and the cost exacted quietly in children's dimmed laughter, parents' fading vitality, and households lulled into lethargy. The last bottle in the Harroway home was removed with care. It was catalogued, examined, and locked away, a final witness to the slow erosion that had occurred in secrecy. Yet the memory lingered, in every teaspoon measured, every pinch of powder dispensed, every sip of cordial taken without question. The quiet damage had already been done. No law, no revelation, no formal investigation could undo the subtle theft of vitality, appetite, and energy that had touched the family so thoroughly. London inhaled the fog that evening, thick with chemical sweetness and the unspoken weight of countless households. The city had been altered imperceptibly, irrevocably, and the last bottle, inert, amber, and silent, bore witness to the quiet calamity that no apology or discovery could ever fully undo. The spell had ended, yet its traces would remain, lingering like a sigh across streets, parlours, and homes for many winters to come. The first tremors of fear moved through London with a subtle, uneven rhythm, like fog curling along the cobblestones and around gas lamps. It was not the sort of fear that erupted in public spectacle or crowded squares. It was quieter, more insidious, a creeping awareness in parlours, kitchens, and drawing rooms, carried in whispered tones, careful glances, and the half-conscious dread of those who had finally understood that the remedies they had trusted for months could no longer be accepted without question. London had learned, at last, to fear its cures. In the Harroway household, the realization had struck like cold air entering through a cracked window. Charles's restless movements were now watched with new intensity, his every sigh, every twitch of the small fingers, measured against the knowledge that even the gentlest teaspoon of powder or cordial had carried hidden consequence. Mrs. Harroway, once confident in her administration of measured doses, now held each bottle with a trembling hand. The sweetness that had previously brought her reassurance now pressed upon her chest with a heavy, suffocating weight. Every sip, every pinch, felt like a potential undoing of all that she had sought to protect. Mr. Harroway, too, felt the chill of newly recognized danger. His cordial, once a source of comfort and reprieve from long days at the counting-house, now appeared suspect. Each amber drop a quiet reminder of the subtle lethargy that had begun to soften his mind and dull his precision. He stared at the bottle as though it were a stranger, and for the first time considered that the trust he had placed in it might have been misplaced entirely. Across the city, the change was palpable. Households previously confident in the benevolence of tonics and powders now moved with a cautious vigilance. Mothers questioned every measure, calculating doses with careful scrutiny. Fathers reconsidered the nightly cordials they had once consumed without thought. Children, who had been lulled into obedient stillness, were roused gently and observed closely. The fog outside pressed against the streets, carrying with it the faint chemical sweetness that had once charmed the city, now a subtle signal of treachery. The newspapers played their part. Reports of adverse effects, once buried in small columns, were now read widely, discussed in parlours and market stalls, and cited in letters exchanged between concerned neighbours. Londoners began to speak openly of hesitation, of doubt, of mistrust. Apothecaries, once confident in their assurances, encountered questions they could not answer, arguments they could not dismiss. Physicians, even those who had denied the possibility of harm, now faced scrutiny from the very families they had sought to protect. The city had begun to understand that its own reliance on chemical remedies, once unquestioned, carried consequences far greater than comfort or convenience. In the Haraway home, the effect was immediate. Doses were reduced, carefully measured, administered only under the watchful eyes of the nurse. The powder behind the mirror, once a nightly ritual, was placed on a high shelf and left untouched. The cordial remained, but no longer freely poured. It was treated as a tool, not a comfort. Families, for the first time in months, observed their children with renewed attention, watched the subtle signs of vitality return, and hesitated before offering any chemical reprieve without consideration. The fog outside seemed to thin slightly, as though London itself were learning to breathe more carefully, to sniff the air before inhaling, to recognize that even what appeared gentle could carry danger. The streets, still damp and grey, held a new quietness, not one of chemical-induced lethargy, but of attentive watchfulness. London had learned a truth that the tonics and powders had concealed, that cures, when trusted blindly, could harm as subtly as disease. And as families across the city adjusted their routines, monitored their children, and questioned the authority of long-trusted remedies, the city itself began to move cautiously, aware that vigilance, rather than blind faith, was now the true measure of protection. The sweetness remained in the air, faint and lingering, but London, newly wary, inhaled it with suspicion rather than trust. Even after the last bottle was locked away, the final teaspoon measured and set aside, the tonics and powders had left an indelible mark upon the city. The sweetness they carried did not vanish with the cessation of use. It lingered in the air, clinging to curtains, to the woodwork, to the very stone of London's fog-bound streets. It was a ghost of every measured dose, every discreet administration behind mirrors and mantles, a quiet perfume that reminded the city of the trust it had placed and the peril that had quietly walked into its homes. In the Haraway household, the effects were still visible. Charles, though gradually more lively, still carried the residue of weeks of sedation in the fragile delicacy of his limbs. Mrs. Haraway moved through her rooms with more confidence now, yet the memory of guilt weighed upon her like a shadow. She touched each surface cautiously, as though the air itself might betray her past indiscretions. Mr. Haraway, aware of his own near dependence on cordial, treated the remaining bottles with wary reverence, their amber glow a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between comfort and harm. Yet, the true residue was not in bodies alone. It lingered in minds, in habits, and in the hushed voices of servants who had witnessed too much. Lily, the housemaid, still walked the halls with acute awareness of every sound, every shift in light, every whisper of scent. She remembered the countless mornings when she had observed the subtle decline in her young master, the tremor in Mrs. Haraway's hands, and the soft, weighted gait of Mr. Haraway. She carried the memory like a second shadow, inseparable from her own presence in the household. Across London, The subtle sweetness clung in parlors and kitchens, in narrow stairways and dim corridors, reaching even those who had never touched the tonics. Mothers inhaled it and paused, recalling the delicate balance between care and inadvertent harm. Fathers frowned, as the scent reminded them of evenings spent lulled into false calm. Children, too young to articulate the memory, sensed the atmosphere of quieted vigor that had once permeated their lives. The fog outside continued to press against windows, curling in around gas lamps and cobblestones, carrying the lingering aroma through the streets. Even as families resumed a more natural rhythm, laughter returning, meals consumed with intent, footsteps lighter, the city retained a faint echo of the chemical calm that had once dulled it. It was an invisible residue, a haunting memory, a subtle admonition that trust must be measured as carefully as the substances it embraces. The newspapers, the courts, the coroner's notes, all had done their part to awaken the city to the danger it had invited. London had begun to observe its children, monitor its families, and question the authority of remedies once unquestioned. Yet the sweetness remained, like a ghostly reminder that comfort, no matter how kindly intended, can leave traces that endure long after its use ceases. In parlors and stairways, in kitchens and bedrooms, families breathed it in, half conscious of its presence, half remembering the invisible toll it had exacted. The air itself seemed to pulse with a memory, whispering of caution, of vigilance, of the delicate line between care and harm. And in the Haraway home, as Charles laughed softly over a newly discovered game, Mrs. Haraway brushed his hair gently, and Mr. Haraway adjusted the curtains to let light through the foggy morning. The scent lingered still, a quiet sweetness, faint but persistent, a reminder that the city had survived its own trust, and that some traces, like memory, like guilt, like vigilance, never entirely fade. London had endured, but the sweet scent never quite left. It drifted through halls, through streets, through lives, a whisper of the past, a lesson in the subtlety of danger, and a reminder that even in calm, vigilance must endure.